He left no body, he left no grave, he left no signed confession, no courtroom verdict, no photograph of a final moment. What he did leave behind were blueprints, detailed, precise, meticulously drafted, bearing a single name, a single signature, across some of the most catastrophic construction projects in the history of the modern world. His name was Hans Kammler, and by the spring of 1945, he had simply ceased to exist. Most people who shaped the machinery of the Second World War ended their stories in a recognizable way. Some were captured, some stood trial, some were hanged, some fled. But this man, an engineer by training, a bureaucrat by temperament, and a true believer by choice, managed something that historians and intelligence agencies spent decades trying to explain. He walked into the collapsing wreckage of the Third Reich and stepped out the other side, leaving behind only questions, competing accounts, contradictory testimonies, and files that, according to at least one American archivist, appeared to have been deliberately cleaned. Tonight, or this evening, or whatever quiet hour has brought you to this particular corner of history, settle in. This is a story that will take a while. It should take a while. Because the life of Hans Kammler was not a simple story, and it did not have a clean ending. It was a story of ambition built on ruins, of cold technical genius applied to catastrophic ends, of a man who rose to a position of nearly unchecked power within the most powerful apparatus of state violence the 20th century had ever seen, and then vanished, just as that apparatus crumbled around him. If you are here to sleep, let the story carry you. If you are here to learn, hold on to what follows. And if you find yourself somewhere between the two, that drowsy, half-lit space where documentary narration becomes its own kind of dreaming, then this is exactly the place for you. We begin, as all stories of this kind begin, not in a moment of crisis, but in something far more ordinary. We begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. The ordinary beginning of an extraordinary monster. The city of Stettin, in the late summer of 1901, was a Baltic port, busy, industrial, grey with river light and the smell of coal smoke and ship timber. It was not a city of philosophers or artists. It was a city of engineers, of administrators, of men who built things and managed things, and kept the machinery of a late imperial economy running smoothly. On the 26th of August of that year, in a middle-class household in this ordinary city, a boy was born who would one day oversee the construction of hell, not the metaphorical kind, but the architectural kind. His name was Hans Friedrich Karl Franz Kammler. Nobody noticed. Nobody could have known. His childhood left almost no trace in the historical record, which is itself a kind of fact. He was not remarkable in those early years. He did not stand out. He was the product of a German bourgeois upbringing at a time when Germany was still an empire, still a monarchy, still a country that believed in order and hierarchy, and the civilizing mission of Germanic culture spread outward across Europe and the world. These were not unusual beliefs for the time and the place. They were, in a way, the air that a boy of that background breathed from the moment he could breathe at all. The first indication that something in Kammler pointed toward extremity came in 1919, when he was not yet 20 years old. Germany had lost the First World War. The empire had collapsed. The Kaiser had abdicated, and in the rubble of that defeat, a generation of young German men found themselves without purpose, without structure, and without any framework for understanding what had just happened to their country. Many of them joined things, movements, volunteer units, organizations that gave the shapelessness of defeat some form of military order and ideological meaning. Kammler joined the Rossbach Freikorps, one of those irregular paramilitary units that operated in the chaotic borderlands between war and peace in the immediate post-war years. He was a young man who, when the world fell apart around him, did not look inward. He looked for something to join. After his brief time with the Freikorps, Kammler took the path that might have seemed, from the outside, like a return to normalcy. He enrolled to study civil engineering, spending time at institutions in Danzig and Munich, two cities with their own distinct political climates, and both already beginning to generate the currents of nationalist agitation that would define the decade ahead. He was a serious student. He worked hard. He had a talent for precision and a comfort with large-scale planning that would serve him well, later, in ways he almost certainly did not yet imagine. In November of 1932, just months before the world changed, he was awarded his Doctorate of Engineering from the Technische Hochschule. The title was Dr. Ing, Doctor Engineer. He had earned it legitimately. He would use it in service of things no academic institution ever intended a doctorate to serve. By the time he completed his education, Germany was already in motion. The 1920s had been a decade of extraordinary cultural ferment and political instability. The Weimar Republic, born out of defeat and compromise, had lurched from crisis to crisis. Hyperinflation, political violence, foreign occupation of industrial regions, the constant pull of extremist movements on both left and right. By the early 1930s, the National Socialists under Adolf Hitler had transformed from a fringe street movement into the largest political party in the Reichstag. The country was tilting, and educated men across Germany were making choices about which side of the tilt to stand on. Kammler made his choice early. In 1931, a full 2 years before Hitler came to power, he joined the Nazi Party. This was not the decision of a man following the crowd. This was the decision of a true believer. What drove that belief? The historical record offers some answers, though none of them fully satisfy. We know that Kammler was attracted to the Nazi conception of technology as an expression of racial and national superiority. One historian described the mindset of engineers like Kammler as seeing no contradiction between notions of blood and soil and the methods of modern organization and technology. They believed that modern engineering, rational, systematic, efficient, was itself an expression of Germanic civilization's superiority over the chaotic, primitive world around it. They believed that building things, great things, powerful things, was a form of national destiny. Kammler held these beliefs with a rigidity that even his colleagues found extreme. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and a man not known for squeamishness about ideology, would eventually come to fear Kammler, placing him, in his own later words, among Himmler's most brutal and most ruthless henchmen. That is a remarkable thing for Albert Speer to say about anyone. In the years immediately following the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Kammler's career took its first careful steps upward through the bureaucracy of the new state. He took a position as head of the Aviation Ministry's building department, which suited both his technical training and his administrative temperament. It was unglamorous work, overseeing construction projects, managing contractors, reviewing blueprints, signing documents. But it placed him in proximity to the machinery of the state, and it gave him a reputation as a man who could get things built on time and under pressure. In 1933, he joined the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Heinrich Himmler's elite organization that had grown from a personal bodyguard into the political and racial enforcement arm of the Nazi regime. His first assignment within the SS was, on the surface, almost comically mundane: leadership of the Reichsbund der Kleingärtner und Kleinsiedler, the Reich's Federation of Allotment Gardeners and Small Homeowners. He was, technically, overseeing the administration of garden plots. Nobody would have looked at Hans Kammler in 1933 and seen the future. But the future was already being assembled, piece by piece, in ways that none of the individual pieces seemed to suggest. Germany was rearming. The SS was expanding. The bureaucracies of racial ideology were being institutionalized, given office space and budgets and filing systems and personnel. A man of Kammler's particular combination of technical skill and ideological commitment was exactly the kind of instrument that the SS needed, as it grew from a political organization into something that would eventually function as a state within a state, with its own economic empire, its own military units, and its own construction projects of a scale and nature that no one in 1933 could quite have imagined. He worked through the mid-1930s with the quiet diligence of a career bureaucrat. He accumulated credentials. He impressed superiors. He demonstrated, repeatedly, that he was the kind of man who could take a project, however large, however complex, however morally indifferent it required him to be, and deliver results. In 1934, he produced a written treatise about the expansion of Germany eastward, in which he argued that the subjugation of that territory would require the elimination of somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. He was 33 years old. He wrote it down. He put it in a document. He signed his name to it. That fact alone tells you almost everything you need to know about the man's inner architecture. He was not someone who fell into atrocity by accident or pressure. He thought his way there, calmly, with the same systematic precision he applied to everything else. When you look at the trajectory of Hans Kammler's early life, the Freikorps at 18, the party card at 29, the SS uniform at 31, the blueprint for mass killing at 33, you are not looking at radicalization in the way we sometimes use that word, as if it describes a process of contamination from the outside. You are looking at the steady and deliberate expression of a worldview that was, for him, coherent from the beginning. He believed in a Germany of racial hierarchy and technical mastery. He believed that the barriers between what needed to be done and what morality would normally prohibit were simply engineering problems. He would spend the rest of his career proving that he meant it. Chapter 2. The Architecture of the SS Empire, _. There is a version of this story that moves quickly, that leaps from the ordinary beginning to the extraordinary horror, from the garden administrator to the construction chief of the death camps, as if the middle part were obvious. But the middle part is not obvious. The middle part is where the machinery was assembled, where a bureaucracy grew into an empire, and where a man like Hans Kammler found the structure that would allow his particular combination of talents to expand into something monstrous at a scale that would not have been possible without that structure. To understand Kammler, you have to understand the SS, not as a simple organization of uniformed villains, but as a genuine institutional ecosystem with its own internal politics, its own economic logic, and its own career ladder. By the late 1930s, the SS under Heinrich Himmler had grown far beyond its original function. It had become, in effect, a parallel government, with its own intelligence service, its own economic enterprises, its own armed forces, and its own construction arm. The construction arm was the part that mattered most to Kammler's trajectory. The SS required buildings, barracks, administrative offices, training facilities, research centers, and as the regime's ambitions expanded, so did the scale and nature of what needed to be built. In 1938, Kammler formally joined the Allgemeine SS, the General SS, and began moving through the bureaucratic structures that would eventually land him at the center of the organization's most consequential construction operations. His ascent through the SS hierarchy in these years followed a pattern that will be familiar to anyone who has studied how large bureaucracies work. He identified the people who mattered. He cultivated relationships with them. He delivered on his commitments. He made himself useful. He was eventually attached to the office of Oswald Pohl, the head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, known by its German acronym WW2, which was the central command structure for the SS's vast economic empire, including its use of prisoner labor. This was not a peripheral appointment. The WW2 was, in a very real sense, the administrative spine of the Holocaust's industrial dimension. It managed the concentration camp system. It managed the forced labor programs. It managed the construction of everything the SS needed built. And Kammler, as Pohl's deputy and then as the chief of Office C, the Construction and Engineering Division, was positioned at a node of this administrative network that gave him oversight of projects that would, within a few years, stretch across occupied Europe. In June of 1941, Kammler joined the Waffen-SS, the armed military wing of the organization. This was partly a matter of administrative formality, partly a matter of rank advancement. The Waffen-SS offered a clearer path to the higher general officer grades that Kammler was by now clearly aiming for. His ambition was not in question. His superiors noted it. His subordinates felt it. He was the kind of man who knew exactly where he wanted to end up, and who worked toward that destination with a focus that could look, depending on your perspective, like dedication, or like something colder and more calculating than dedication. What did Office C actually do in these years? On paper, it designed and built facilities. It managed construction contracts and labor allocation. It reviewed architectural plans and approved expenditures. In practice, and this is the part where the bureaucratic language begins to break down, it designed and built concentration camps, extermination camps, the physical infrastructure of mass murder. Kammler was the chief of the office responsible for deciding where the barracks would go, how many people they would hold, how the perimeter fencing would be arranged, how the administrative buildings would be positioned relative to the work sites, and, As the camps evolved into something beyond concentration, into something that defies ordinary vocabulary, how the facilities for mass killing would be designed and constructed. He was, in the most precise and technical sense of the word, the architect of the Holocaust's physical form. The historian Michael Thad Allen, who spent years studying the SS's economic and construction operations, described Kammler as a man in whom technological competence and extreme Nazi fanaticism coexisted in the same man. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is surprising, but because it is exact. There was no contradiction, in Kammler's mind, between being good at his job and being utterly without moral restraint in how he applied that skill. The job was engineering. The engineering happened to serve genocide. For Kammler, that was not a moral problem. It was a technical context. By the time he had fully established himself within the WW2 and Office C, Kammler had built a remarkable degree of institutional authority. He was known to scrutinize the ideological commitment of his subordinates as carefully as he scrutinized their technical qualifications, incorporating both into decisions about their duty assignments and promotions. He ran his construction empire with a combination of bureaucratic precision and ideological rigidity that made him both feared and, in the strange internal culture of the SS, respected. Even within an organization that rewarded ruthlessness, Kammler stood out. His nickname among those who worked under him and around him was Stabwolke, dust cloud, a reference to the relentless pace at which he moved from site to site, descending on his projects with the restless intensity of a man who could not tolerate delays. The SS construction empire that Kammler managed in these years was not just a matter of building camps. It was a genuine economic and logistical operation of considerable complexity. The projects under his authority spanned occupied Poland, the occupied Soviet Union, the German heartland, and the territories of Western Europe that had come under German control. Each project required labor, and labor, in the context of the SS's operations, meant prisoners, concentration camp inmates, people stripped of their legal status, their humanity, their lives. Kammler managed the allocation of this labor with the same dispassion with which he managed everything else. They were a resource, they were an input, they were, in the language that floated through the SS's internal memoranda, pieces, Stücke, a dehumanizing term that the administrative apparatus used to reduce human beings to countable units. Kammler used this language. He operated within it completely naturally. The evidence suggests he found nothing unusual about it. It is important, here at the end of this chapter, to step back from the administrative detail and remember what we are actually describing. The SS construction empire that Kammler ran was not a story of buildings. It was a story of human beings, hundreds of thousands of them, eventually millions of them, whose suffering and death were the material cost of those buildings. Every camp that Kammler designed was a place where people were starved, worked to death, beaten, shot, and in the camps that crossed the line from concentration to extermination, systematically murdered at industrial scale. Kammler did not pull the trigger or open the gas valves himself. He did something in some ways more terrible. He designed the system that made all of it possible at scale, optimized it for efficiency, and managed it with professional pride. The blueprints are still in the archives. His signature is on them. Chapter 3. The Blueprints of Birkenau, _. In the late autumn of 1941, a memo crossed Hans Kammler's desk with an address at the top, Auschwitz. The camp at Auschwitz had existed since 1940 as a concentration camp, a brutal place of forced labor and deliberate cruelty, but one that had not yet been transformed into what it would become. By the time Kammler received that memo, the regime was in the process of making a decision, one of the most consequential decisions in the history of human cruelty, about what to do with the Jewish population of Europe. The ideology was not new. The desire was not new. What was new, in the autumn of 1941, was the commitment to a systematic, industrial-scale program of murder. And that commitment required, like all things the regime undertook, the right infrastructure. On the 26th of September 1941, Kammler issued the order for the construction of the largest camp expansion at Auschwitz. It was an administrative act, a memo, a signed order, the kind of document that passes through bureaucracies every day without anyone looking twice. In this case, the document ordered the construction of Birkenau, the adjacent extension to the original camp, that would, over the following years, become the site of the largest single act of mass murder in recorded history. Kammler did not write the policy that drove Birkenau's function. He did not devise the ideology behind it. What he did was translate that ideology and that policy into concrete plans, into measured distances between fence lines, into calculated prisoner capacity per barrack block, into specifications for the crematoria that would eventually be built to handle the impossible human arithmetic of what was happening there. In December of that same year, 1941, Kammler sent an update to Himmler about the progress of construction at Auschwitz-Birkenau and at Majdanek, another camp being built simultaneously in occupied Poland. His tone was professional and slightly frustrated. Construction was delayed, he reported, due to freezing weather, a shortage of materials, and insufficient labor. He was not reporting on human suffering, he was reporting on a construction schedule. The distance between those two things, the administrative language and the human reality it described, is perhaps the most vertiginous aspect of reading these documents today. He was talking about building places where people would be murdered, and his concern was that the weather was slowing things down. By late March of 1942, the systematic mass deportation of Jews to Auschwitz had begun. The camp that Kammler was building was not yet complete. The facilities were not yet at their full operational scale. But the people were arriving nonetheless, transported from across occupied Europe in conditions of deliberate degradation, arriving at a place that was still, in some physical sense, a construction site. The interaction between the arriving prisoners and the ongoing construction was not incidental. The arriving prisoners became the construction labor. The slave laborers who were building the camp were building the place in which they, and others like them, would die. This was not an unintended irony. It was, in the cold calculus of SS administration, a feature. In the summer of 1942, Kammler supervised the planning and approval of new crematoria at Birkenau. The scale of the planned facilities was extraordinary, designed, in the documentation of the time, to handle the burning of up to 120,000 corpses per month. These were not vague aspirational figures. They were engineering specifications. They told you, in precise technical language, the capacity that the facility needed to achieve, and they drove the architectural decisions that followed, the layout of the buildings, the positioning of the furnaces, the ventilation requirements, the logistical flow from one part of the facility to the next. Kammler's great innovation, if that word can be applied without flinching, was to convert what had originally been designed as underground morgues into functional gas chambers, and to add a small freight elevator to carry bodies up to the crematoria above. It was a practical engineering solution to a logistical problem. The problem was the industrial processing of mass murder. The solution was an elevator. The detail of the elevator is not a detail that historians dwell on for its shock value. It is a detail that matters because it illustrates something specific about Kammler's mode of operation. He was not simply approving plans drafted by others. He was actively engaged in the technical problem-solving, down to individual design elements, of how to make the killing facilities work more efficiently. His involvement was granular. He reviewed barracks dimensions. He approved perimeter fence designs. He signed off on the positioning of watchtowers relative to the prisoner population that the camp was designed to hold. The historian Nikolaus Wachsmann concluded that Kammler was intimately involved in all the major building projects in Auschwitz. The word intimately carries a particular weight in that sentence that its author almost certainly intended. Beyond Auschwitz-Birkenau, the construction operations under Kammler's authority extended to camps across occupied Europe, Majdanek in occupied Poland, Sobibor. The expansion of the camp system was a continuous, evolving project that Kammler managed with the same administrative energy he brought to everything else. By the time the Holocaust was in its full operational phase in 1943, the physical infrastructure of the killing, the camps, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the railway sidings, the processing facilities, had largely been built under his direction. The architecture of genocide bore his signature, literally. Work orders, construction approvals, planning documents, found in archives in Poland and Germany and the United States, carry his name. He could not claim, as some later tried to, that he did not know. He knew everything. He had approved everything. In many cases, he had personally designed the critical details. In the spring of 1943, Kammler's construction unit was given another task, the razing of the Warsaw Ghetto. By this point, the ghetto had been the site of the uprising that bore its name, a remarkable act of armed resistance by the surviving Jewish population of Warsaw against the overwhelming force of the SS and Wehrmacht units sent to liquidate it. The uprising was suppressed, and in its aftermath, Kammler's engineers moved in to demolish what remained, to erase, physically, the structures that had housed hundreds of thousands of people who were now, in their vast majority, dead. This was construction in reverse, the systematic destruction of an urban area, carried out with the same professional efficiency that Kammler brought to building things. He was building the camps that received the deportees from the east. Now he was erasing the physical traces of the places from which those deportees had been taken. His fingerprints were on both ends of the process. Through all of this, Kammler continued to rise. His rank within the SS advanced in step with the scale of the projects he managed. His relationship with Himmler deepened. The SS chief valued men who could operate at scale without flinching, and Kammler was demonstrably that kind of man. He was, in the internal culture of the SS, a rising star. What is strange, in retrospect, is not that he rose. Within the logic of that institution, his advancement was entirely consistent. What is strange is how little known he was outside the internal circles of the SS and the Reich's bureaucracy. Albert Speer knew who he was. Himmler knew who he was. The engineers and architects who worked under him knew who he was. But the wider world, even the wartime world of Allied intelligence, which was watching Germany closely, had only a partial and incomplete picture of a man who was, by 1943, one of the most powerful figures in the Reich's administrative machinery. It would not remain incomplete for long, because in the summer of 1943, everything was about to change. The British Royal Air Force was about to deal a significant blow to the German rocket program, and the response to that blow would put Hans Kammler on a path that transformed him from a bureaucrat of genocide into something the regime had never quite had before, a single man with control over the most advanced technology in the world and the slave labor empire to build it. Chapter 4, From Death Camps to Rocket Factories, _ On the night of the 17th of August, 1943, several hundred Royal Air Force bombers flew north over the Baltic and turned east toward a peninsula on the German coast called Peenemünde. What the air crews were targeting was not a factory in the traditional sense, not a rail yard or a bridge or an oil depot. It was a research and testing facility, the place where the German military had been developing a weapon unlike anything that had ever been built before. The weapon was called the Aggregate 4, and its operational name, chosen for its propaganda value, was the V2 Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. It was a ballistic missile. It flew on a trajectory that took it out of the atmosphere entirely, arcing above the clouds and the weather and the reach of any conventional defense, before falling back to Earth on its target. It could carry roughly a 1-ton warhead, at speeds that made it entirely invisible and entirely unstoppable by the technology of the time. The British bombers that night were trying to destroy it before it could be deployed. The raid did significant damage to the Peenemünde facility. It killed a number of researchers and workers. It set back the program's timeline by several months that would prove, in retrospect, to be significant. But it did not destroy the program. What it did instead was trigger a decision by Hitler and Albert Speer, whose ministry controlled war production, to move the V2 program underground, away from the reach of Allied bombers, into facilities that could be hidden from aerial reconnaissance and protected by the depth of the German earth itself. The SS, with its enormous reserves of slave labor, was identified as the organization best suited to carry out this construction at the speed the program demanded, and the SS construction chief, Hans Kammler, was the man given the task. The facility that Kammler built to house the V2 production was called the Mittelwerk, the Central Works, and it was carved into the side of a mountain in the Harz region of central Germany, in an area called Thuringia. The tunnels already existed. They had been bored into the mountain earlier in the war as part of a fuel storage project. What Kammler did was transform them into the world's first underground rocket factory, adapting and expanding the existing tunnel system to accommodate the entire V2 production line, from component assembly to final integration, all inside a mountain, invisible from the air. By the end of August 1943, within weeks of the Peenemünde raid, Kammler had a substantial detachment of concentration camp prisoners from Buchenwald working inside the tunnels. The speed at which this happened was itself a kind of horror. The camp that was established to house the workers at Mittelwerk was initially a subcamp of Buchenwald, but the population grew so rapidly and the conditions became so severe that a separate camp had to be created. This camp was called Mittelbau-Dora. What happened inside Mittelbau-Dora, in the early months especially, before the camp's infrastructure had been fully established and the prisoners were living and working and dying entirely within the tunnels themselves, represents one of the most concentrated episodes of industrial human suffering of the entire war. The tunnels were not designed for habitation. There was no ventilation. There was almost no sanitation. The workers labored in shifts through the day and night, carving rock and pouring concrete and assembling rocket components, sleeping when they could on the tunnel floors or on makeshift bunks in the rock, breathing air thick with chalk dust and chemical fumes, eating almost nothing, dying in numbers that the camp's administrative records tracked with the same detached precision that characterized everything in Kammler's operations. Kammler was clear about his priorities at Mittelbau-Dora. When conditions in the tunnels were raised with him, when the death rate among workers was flagged as a potential operational problem, he gave an answer that was later recorded and preserved. "Do not worry about the victims," he said. "The work must proceed in the shortest time possible." That sentence is the clearest single statement of his operational philosophy. Workers were not a constraint, they were a consumable. If they died, more would be sent. The important thing was the work. The important thing was always the work. The work did proceed. V2 production at Mittelwerk ramped up with a speed that astonished even those within the program who had seen what Kammler was capable of. By the time the rockets began reaching operational units in the autumn of 1944, the underground factory was producing them in quantities that the Peenemünde facility could never have matched. More than 5,200 V2 missiles were built at Mittelwerk over the course of the program's operation. More than 2,275 V1 flying bombs were also produced there. These figures represent an industrial achievement of considerable magnitude. They also represent something that is harder to quantify, but more important to remember. Researchers who have studied the Mittelbau-Dora camp estimate that of the roughly 60,000 people who passed through it, approximately 10,000 died producing the V2 alone, a number double the estimated 5,000 people killed by the weapon system itself in Britain and Belgium. More than 20,000 died at the camp in total, across its entire period of operation. The weapon killed more people being built than it killed being used. Alongside the V2, Kammler's growing empire now encompassed the production of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, an aircraft that was, by the standards of the time, frighteningly advanced. In April 1944, Hitler gave Kammler full control over jet aircraft production. This was a remarkable transfer of authority. A man who 18 months earlier had been primarily known as the SS's construction administrator was now controlling the development and production of the most advanced aviation technology in the world. His empire had expanded from concrete and steel into aluminum alloys and jet engines, from the architecture of death camps to the architecture of supersonic flight. The expansion said something important about how the regime worked in its final years. As conventional military structures buckled under the pressure of the war, men like Kammler, who could operate without institutional constraint and without moral hesitation, were given more and more authority, regardless of whether that authority made rational organizational sense. By 1944, Kammler was a figure of extraordinary power within the Reich's military-industrial complex. He answered directly to Himmler and increasingly to Hitler himself. He had displaced or subordinated men who had built their careers in the rocket program, men like Walter Dornberger, who had been the Wehrmacht's V2 program director and who was formally replaced by Kammler as the director of V2 operations on the 8th of August, 1944. These were not easy displacements. The rocket scientists and engineers who had spent years developing the V2 at Peenemünde did not generally like Kammler. They feared him. They resented him. Wernher von Braun, the program's most brilliant scientist, had a deeply complicated relationship with Kammler, one that was simultaneously professional, obligatory, and underwritten by a mutual awareness that both of them knew things about the other that could be dangerous. This complexity would become important, very important, in the months ahead. The first V-2 rockets were launched operationally on the 8th of September 1944 from a site near The Hague in occupied Holland, targeting London. They were 46 feet long, reached 55 miles into the atmosphere at the top of their trajectory, and fell back to Earth at speeds that made any warning system useless. They were terrifying, not just for what they did, but for what they represented. A weapon against which there was, in 1944, no defense. Kammler had built the factory that made them. He commanded the units that launched them. He was, in a very direct operational sense, the man responsible for every rocket that fell on London and Antwerp and Paris in those final months of the war. The weapons were manufactured by people who were dying to build them, and they were launched by a man who had spent the previous 3 years constructing the machinery of the Holocaust. Chapter 5. The Man Who Outgrew the War, _ There is a moment in the history of the Third Reich, somewhere in the closing months of 1944, bleeding into the catastrophic early weeks of 1945, when the regime's internal logic began to consume itself. The military situation was unmistakably terminal. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, crossed into Germany itself. In the east, the Red Army was advancing in operations of a scale and coordination that the Wehrmacht could no longer contest effectively. Germany was losing the war. Everyone who looked at a map with clear eyes knew it. And yet the machinery of the regime continued to function. The promotions, the internal competitions for power and resources and authority, the bureaucratic battles over jurisdiction and funding, as if the information on the map were somehow not applicable to the world inside the offices and headquarters where these battles were fought. Into this surreal bureaucratic continuance, Hans Kammler continued to expand. In January of 1945, Hitler named him the head of all missile projects, an appointment that brought under his direct control every aspect of Germany's ballistic weapons program, from research to production to operational deployment. By this point, the practical significance of this appointment was diminishing rapidly. The supply lines that fed the rocket program were fracturing, the launch sites in Western Europe were being overrun, and the explosives and fuel required to keep the program running were becoming critically scarce. But the appointment itself was meaningful as a statement about Kammler's position within the regime's internal hierarchy. He was not just a construction administrator anymore. He was not just the man who built the camps and the underground factories. He was now, formally, the singular authority over the most advanced weapons system Germany possessed. He answered, by the beginning of 1945, only to Hitler. In March of that same year, the expansion continued. Hitler stripped Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most senior figures in the Nazi hierarchy, of his powers over aircraft support, maintenance and supply, and transferred those powers to Kammler. This was an extraordinary act. Göring had been one of the founders of the Nazi movement, one of Hitler's oldest allies, and the nominal commander of Germany's entire air power. To strip him of operational control over a significant portion of his own organization and hand it to an SS general was a measure of both how far Kammler had risen and how completely the regime's conventional military structure had been overtaken by the parallel SS apparatus. By early April, Kammler had been formally designated Führer's General Plenipotentiary for Jet Aircraft, a title that gave him authority over a program that was, in theory, Germany's last serious hope for establishing air superiority over the Allied bomber fleets that were destroying German cities by day and night. But titles and reality were diverging at an accelerating rate. The Messerschmitt Me-262, for all its technical brilliance, could not be produced fast enough to change the course of the war. The underground factories were running out of materials. The slave labor force was being ground down by conditions that killed workers faster than replacements could be supplied. The transportation infrastructure that moved components between production sites was being systematically destroyed by Allied air power. And the men who had once managed these programs with at least some institutional coherence were now operating in a fog of competing orders, incomplete information, and the growing private certainty that the war was over, and the only question that remained was what would happen to each of them personally when it ended. Kammler was not a man who seemed to panic. The record suggests he remained, through these final weeks, in motion, physically, administratively, strategically. He issued orders. He moved between locations. He maintained contact, or attempted to maintain contact, with the various nodes of his empire as it fragmented around him. On the 1st of April 1945, he ordered the evacuation of roughly 500 missile technicians, the core of the technical expertise that had built and operated the V2 program, to the area of the so-called Alpine Fortress, the mountainous region of southern Germany and Austria, where some within the regime still imagined a final redoubt might be established. This order was partly tactical and partly strategic. The technicians needed to be kept out of Soviet hands, that much was obvious. But the order also reflected Kammler's growing awareness that the technical knowledge those men possessed, and that he himself possessed, as their administrative master, was the most valuable currency in the world that was about to emerge from the ruins of the one that was collapsing. On the 5th of April 1945, Kammler was assigned by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht to command the defense of the Nordhausen area, the region around the Mittelwerk underground factory in Thuringia, which was now directly in the path of advancing Allied forces. It was a conventional military assignment. He was expected to defend the area. He did not. Instead, he immediately issued orders for the destruction of the special V1 equipment at a storage site called Syke, and began evacuating personnel and materials southward, away from the approaching front. He was not going to stand and fight for a piece of German territory. Whatever Kammler was doing in the first weeks of April 1945, defending Germany was not it. His movements in this period became, from the perspective of later historians, a kind of puzzle, a series of documented appearances at different locations, separated by gaps and contradictions, that no single narrative fully resolves. On the 16th of April, he sent a telegram to Speer, Himmler and Göring, informing them of the creation of a message center at Munich and the appointment of an operations chief for the May 262 program, a communication that reads, given the circumstances, as either deeply deluded or deliberately designed to give the impression that normal operations were continuing. On the 20th of April, he reportedly arrived at Himmler's headquarters near Salzburg. On the 22nd, he appeared in Oberammergau in Bavaria, where he encountered Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger, two men who were, by this point, actively exploring the possibility of surrendering to American forces. The meeting between Kammler, von Braun, and Dornberger in Oberammergau was brief and unproductive. They failed to agree on a joint course of action. The divergence of their interests was becoming clear. Von Braun wanted to surrender to the Americans and continue his career as a rocket scientist. He had already taken steps to make contact with Allied forces. Kammler's situation was different. He was not a scientist whose technical knowledge made him a candidate for rehabilitation. He was a man whose administrative record included the construction of death camps and the management of a slave labor empire that had killed tens of thousands of people. He could not walk into an American camp and offer his services the way von Braun could. His currency was different. What he had to offer was not expertise in rocket science, but something potentially more valuable: detailed knowledge of where the assets of the V-weapons program had been hidden, where the documents were, where the personnel were, and where the physical equipment had been concealed in the chaos of the final weeks of the war. He knew the locations of things that both the Americans and the Soviets desperately wanted. That knowledge was, potentially, a bargaining chip. But to use it, he needed to find the right buyer before time ran out. From Oberammergau, Kammler moved eastward and then south, following a path through Austria that becomes harder to trace with each passing day. He appeared at the Villa Mendelssohn in Ebensee, the headquarters of an SS operations unit and the site of a concentration camp and arms factory that fell within his administrative domain. He appeared to give orders and then withdraw. He seemed to be moving without a fixed destination, maintaining the external form of command activity while navigating, quietly, carefully, towards some outcome that he had already begun to calculate. Chapter 6. The Last Known Hours, _. The first days of May 1945 were extraordinary in their compression. In Berlin, the Red Army was fighting its way through the capital block by block. Hitler was dead. He died by his own hand on the 30th of April, and the Nazi state was dissolving with a speed that few had believed possible even weeks earlier. Across Germany, in forests and towns and along roads clogged with the wreckage of a defeated army, millions of soldiers and civilians and administrators were trying to figure out what to do next. Some fought on. Some surrendered immediately, some tried to disappear, to shed their uniforms, assume new identities, and walk away from what they had done into whatever world was about to be built from the rubble. Hans Kammler's precise movements in these days are a matter of testimony and conjecture, with the two categories overlapping in ways that make absolute certainty impossible. What is known is that on the morning of the 4th of May, he gave an order from the Villa Mendelssohn at Ebensee for the immediate transfer of his SS Special Inspection Unit to Prague, a move that even some of his own subordinates reportedly described as a suicide mission, given how rapidly the situation in Bohemia was deteriorating. He then drove in the direction of Linz, a city that was captured by American forces on the 5th of May, and at some point in that journey became separated from others in his convoy, including a senior colleague named Karl Sau. On the 6th of May, one day before Germany's unconditional surrender, he was allegedly seen by Gottlob Berger, the head of the SS main office, in a town called Kirchdorf in the Tyrol, roughly 200 kilometers west of where he had been the previous day. The geography of these movements, the distances, the directions, the apparent absence of any coherent destination, suggests a man in motion rather than a man with a plan. Or perhaps a man whose plan required him to be somewhere specific by a specific time, and who was navigating toward that somewhere through the chaos of a country in the act of complete institutional collapse. On the 7th of May, British intelligence intercepted a radio message bearing Kammler's signature, addressed to an SS unit at a concentration camp called Leitmeritz in Bohemia, a site believed to have been involved in secret weapons production, requesting a status report on the arrival of his staff. It is unclear whether this message was sent before or after some kind of encounter with Allied forces. It may have been sent from custody. It may have been sent to create a paper trail or to disrupt one. The British intelligence analysts who intercepted it noted its existence but could draw no firm conclusions from it. By this point in the war, the signal traffic flowing through the collapsing Reich's communication systems was a chaos of authentic orders, panicked requests, deliberate deceptions, and transmissions sent by people who were still pretending, for whatever reason, that the institutional structure they had served still existed. After the 7th of May, Kammler vanished. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that he became less prominent. He disappeared from the documentary record entirely, leaving behind a set of competing accounts that have fueled decades of historical investigation and, in some cases, speculation that goes far beyond what the evidence supports. The accounts that emerged in the years immediately following the war were, almost uniformly, accounts of death. Multiple individuals who had known Kammler came forward to say that he had died by his own hand, by cyanide poisoning, somewhere in the Czech borderlands in the final days of the war. His driver, Kurt Pruk, gave a sworn statement that he had personally seen Kammler's corpse and been present at his burial. Another wartime aide, Heinz Soiner, confirmed this account, specifying the 7th of May as the date of death and cyanide as the cause. On the basis of these testimonies, provided by men who had every reason to give the account they gave, and whose statements courts and historians have subsequently judged to be unreliable, the District Court of Berlin-Charlottenburg officially declared Hans Kammler dead as of the 9th of May, 1945, in a ruling handed down on the 7th of September, 1948. The ruling was initiated by Kammler's wife Jutta, who had petitioned for the death declaration just 2 months after the war's end, a speed of administrative action that in retrospect strikes some researchers as itself meaningful. She provided Preuck's statement. The court accepted it. Hans Kammler was, legally, dead. But there is a problem with that official verdict, and the problem is documented, and the documentation is not from conspiracy theorists, but from intelligence agencies of the Allied powers that won the war. On the 2nd of November 1945, nearly 6 months after the date on which Kammler was supposedly dead, and already buried in an unmarked Czech grave, Brigadier General George Clement MacDonald, the Director of Intelligence of the United States Air Forces in Europe, acting under explicit authority from Washington, commissioned the interrogation of Hans Kammler, assigning the task to a chief investigator named Ernst Englander, and expressing particular interest in German underground installations. You do not commission the interrogation of a dead man. The order is unambiguous in its implication. In November of 1945, someone in the American military intelligence apparatus knew, or believed, that Hans Kammler was alive and accessible. A report published in the late 1940s, found in the files of the American Counterintelligence Corps, stated explicitly that, shortly after the occupation, Hans Kammler appeared at CIC Gmunden and gave a statement on operations at Ebensee. The CIC notes on the interview were compiled without naming the interviewee directly, but the report's internal logic, identifying only 3 individuals with access to a specific numbered account associated with SS construction operations, and noting that one was known to have left Austria in May 1945, while another was in a prisoner of war camp, pointed toward Kammler as the most probable subject of the interview. A separate report from 1949, written by an investigator named Oscar Packer and filed by the American Denazification Office in Hesse, stated that Kammler had been arrested by American troops on the 9th of May at the Messerschmitt factory in Oberammergau, but that he and some other senior SS personnel had subsequently managed to escape in the direction of Austria or Italy. And then, more than half a century later, there was something else. A man named Donald W. Richardson, a former OSS special agent who had worked with the ULSO's mission, the Allied Scientific Intelligence Operation, reportedly told his sons, shortly before his death, that he was the man who brought Kammler to the US. According to his sons, Richardson described supervising Kammler in American custody until 1947, at which point Kammler allegedly died by hanging. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, examining this claim in 2019, found documentary evidence that Kammler was indeed captured and interviewed by Americans during May 1945 in Germany, but found nothing to substantiate the claim that he remained in American custody afterward and died there. And then there is the final piece of evidence, the piece that is, in some ways, the most unnerving of all. In 2012, author Dean Reuter submitted a Freedom of Information request to the United States Department of Justice, seeking any records on Hans Kammler. He received a set of documents so heavily redacted as to be nearly useless. 7 years later, before his book went to press, he submitted a second request. The government responded that it had no records about Kammler at all, none. As one American archivist reportedly told Reuter, it was like somebody had come in and cleaned the files. Empty files, missing records. A legal death certificate based on testimony that courts have since labeled fictitious. A military interrogation order issued for a man declared dead. Intelligence reports placing him at American facilities after his supposed suicide. The story of Hans Kammler's final hours does not resolve. It opens, and keeps opening, into questions that no available evidence fully closes. He left no body. He left no grave. He left blueprints. And somewhere between the blueprints and the empty files, the truth of what happened to Hans Kammler, the SS engineer who built the architecture of atrocity, and then, when the reckoning arrived, simply walked out of the frame, is still waiting to be fully found. Chapter 7. The Wonder Weapons and the World That Watched. _ There is a particular kind of desperation that produces technological brilliance, not the steady, patient kind of innovation that emerges from well-funded laboratories in peacetime, but the frantic, compressed, corners-cut variety that emerges when a regime believes it is running out of time and is willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to buy more of it. By the summer of 1944, Germany's military situation had moved from difficult to genuinely catastrophic. The Normandy landings in June had broken the stalemate in the west. Soviet offensives in the east were consuming German armies at a rate that the Wehrmacht could no longer replace. In the south, Italy had effectively been lost as a serious theatre of German strength. In the skies above German cities, Allied bombers were operating, by this point, with a confidence and an impunity that the Luftwaffe's diminished fighter strength could no longer effectively challenge. The regime that had, 5 years earlier, seemed to carry an almost unstoppable momentum was now visibly dying, and into this dying, it poured its last reserves of scientific ambition and human cost. The weapons that emerged from this period are, from a purely technical standpoint, extraordinary. The V2 ballistic missile, the weapon whose production Kammler controlled, was the world's first operational long-range ballistic missile, a machine that outran its own sound on the way down and arrived at its target before the people beneath it could hear it coming. The Me-262 jet fighter, production of which Kammler was given sweeping authority over, was the world's first operational jet-powered combat aircraft, capable of speeds that piston-engine Allied fighters could not match in level flight. The V-1 flying bomb, an early cruise missile, delivered 1-ton warheads to London at a rate that, at its peak, kept the British capital in a state of sustained terror. There were other programs still in development: advanced submarine designs, ground-to-air guided missiles, pressurized aircraft capable of flying above the altitudes that conventional bombers could reach. Germany in 1944 was, in the field of weapons technology, a generation ahead of much of what the Allies were fielding. The tragedy, if that word can be used about a regime that was simultaneously running extermination camps, was that the technical genius was real, and it was embedded in a political and military context that made it ultimately irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Kammler understood this. He was not a man who entertained illusions about the military situation. His actions in the final months of the war suggest a man who had already mentally separated the value of the technology from the fate of the regime that currently owned it. He fought, persistently and with considerable bureaucratic skill, to consolidate authority over as many of the advanced weapons programs as possible: the rocket program, the jet aircraft program, the underground construction empire, the slave labor pools. He accumulated these authorities not because he believed they would win the war — the evidence strongly suggests he had abandoned that belief — but because they gave him something to offer. He was building a portfolio. And the audience he was assembling it for was not in Berlin. The rocket scientists at Peenemünde, the men who had actually designed the V2, who had spent years of their lives in the experimental work that produced this machine, watched Kammler's accumulation of power with a mixture of professional resentment and private fear. Wernher von Braun is the figure whose name has come down through history most prominently from this group, a brilliant young engineer who had dreamed of spaceflight since adolescence and had found, in the German military's desire for a ballistic missile, the funding and the institutional structure to build the rockets he had always imagined. Von Braun was not a simple figure. He held an SS rank, Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major, that he had accepted as a professional necessity in the political climate of the time. He was aware of the slave labor conditions at Mittelbau-Dora, where his rockets were being built, the extent to which he was troubled by those conditions, and the extent to which he allowed himself not to think about them, has been the subject of sustained historical debate ever since. What is clear is that by the spring of 1945, von Braun had decided that his future lay with the Americans, not with the SS general who had taken formal command of his program, and not with the dying regime that employed them both. The relationship between Kammler and von Braun in these final months was deeply uncomfortable for both men. Kammler held formal authority over von Braun. He could, in theory, have had him arrested, and in fact, von Braun was briefly arrested in February 1945 on charges that have never been fully clarified, though they appeared to relate to defeatist comments he had allegedly made about the war's outcome and Germany's prospects for space exploration in the post-war world. He was released after several weeks, partly through the intervention of Walter Dornberger, who argued that arresting the V2's chief designer was not conducive to the continued operation of the program. Kammler signed off on the release. The episode illustrated, in miniature, the dynamic between the two men. Kammler held the power, but von Braun held the knowledge, and each of them knew that the other's value was conditional on the continuation of a program that both of them, privately, understood was approaching its end. Beyond the personal dynamics, the strategic context of the Wonder Weapons program was shifting in ways that Kammler tracked closely. The Americans were moving fast. Their forces on the Western Front were not simply pushing forward militarily, they were also advancing with a specific intelligence and scientific mission: the identification, collection, and where possible, the removal of German scientific and technical personnel, equipment, documents, and physical assets before the Soviets could reach them. This mission operated under several organizational frameworks, most prominently the ALSO's mission, which was focused specifically on Germany's nuclear and advanced weapons programs, and the broader SEOS and TACOM operations that covered the full range of German technical intelligence. The Germans who were paying attention knew that this effort was underway. Kammler, whose intelligence sources within the SS apparatus were still partially functional in the spring of 1945, was certainly one of those who knew, and his movements in the final weeks of the war suggest that he was navigating toward the Americans with the specific intention of making himself useful to them. The question that has never been fully answered is whether the Americans found him sufficiently useful to make a deal. The evidence for such a deal is suggestive but not conclusive. The redacted files, the missing records, the interrogation order issued in November of 1945, the CIC report of an interview. These pieces point in the same direction without quite arriving at a destination. What they suggest is that Kammler did make some form of contact with American intelligence, and that American intelligence did find him sufficiently interesting to engage with, at least briefly. Whether that contact resulted in a formal arrangement, a deal of the kind that Operation Paperclip provided for scientists like von Braun and dozens of others, is something that the available documentary record does not clearly resolve. It is possible that it did, and that the evidence of such a deal was subsequently removed. It is also possible that Kammler's contact with the Americans was brief and unproductive, and that he subsequently escaped through other means or died, as the official German court declared. What is not possible, given the available evidence, is simply dismissing the question. The wonder weapons themselves, the V2s, the Me-262s, the production facilities, the research files, became, in the immediate post-war period, objects of intense competition between the Americans and the Soviets. Both powers sent teams into Germany to collect whatever they could find. The Americans, moving faster in southern and central Germany, secured the core of the V2 program, the Peenemünde personnel, the production files, the training materials, the physical components. They moved 14 tons of V2 technical documents out of a mine in the Harz Mountains, where they had been concealed by German engineers before the American advance reached the area. They shipped more than 100 complete or near-complete V2 missiles back to the United States, and they brought with them, under Operation Paperclip, more than 100 German scientists and engineers, including von Braun himself, who would spend the next 2 decades building the rocket technology that eventually put Americans on the moon. The Wonder Weapons program, stripped of its ideological context and its slave labor infrastructure, was transplanted into American soil and grew there into the foundation of the space age. The debt that the post-war space program owed to the horrors of Mittelbau-Dora was real and documented and uncomfortable, and was for many years not discussed in the celebratory narratives of American achievement in space. In this context of frantic salvage and strategic repositioning, Kammler's knowledge had a specific and considerable value. He knew not just the V2 program, but the entirety of the SS's construction and weapons empire, the locations of the underground factories, the identity and whereabouts of key personnel, the contents of documents that had been hidden before the advance, the details of programs that were still only partially visible to Allied intelligence. He was, in the spring of 1945, a map, a human map of the Reich's most sensitive technical and industrial secrets. Whether the Americans chose to read that map, and under what terms, is the question at the center of the mystery that his disappearance created. And it is a question that, depending on which evidence you choose to weight, can lead you to very different conclusions about what happened to him, and about what kind of institution the American intelligence apparatus was willing to be in those early, urgent, morally ambiguous months after the war. The wonder weapons could not save Germany. Nothing could save Germany by the summer of 1944, but they proved, in the end, to be Hans Kammler's most valuable asset, not as weapons, but as leverage. And Kammler, who had spent his entire career turning assets into leverage, understood their value precisely. He had built the factories that built the weapons. He had managed the men who operated them. He knew where everything was. And in the zero-sum competition between the great powers that was already beginning to take shape in the rubble of the Third Reich, that knowledge was worth a great deal more than a trial at Nuremberg. Chapter 8. The Slave Empire. Labor, Death, and the Arithmetic of Production. The number is deceptively simple. In the final 2 years of the Second World War, somewhere in the range of 14 million people, an estimate that historians continue to refine, were subjected to forced labor under the control of the German state and its various organizational arms. They came from every country that German military power had touched. They were Soviet prisoners of war, condemned by an ideological decision that placed their lives below the threshold of legal protection under the laws of war. They were Jews from across occupied Europe, stripped of citizenship and legal status before they were stripped of anything else. They were Polish civilians, rounded up in operations that burned villages and executed resistors. They were French, Belgian, Dutch, and Czech workers pressed into labor service under conditions that ranged from difficult to lethal. They were inmates of the concentration camp system, men, women, and children, whose labor was managed, allocated, and traded by the SS with the same administrative detachment that a commercial enterprise brings to the management of any other resource. Hans Kammler was not the only man responsible for this system, but he was, in the domain of construction and advanced weapons production, one of its most consequential administrators. The SS's use of prisoner labor in construction had evolved gradually through the late 1930s and early 1940s. Initially, it was used on projects within and adjacent to the camp system itself, the construction of barracks, administrative buildings, the expansion of existing facilities. As the war progressed and the demands on German labor grew, the SS moved aggressively to make its prisoner population available to private industry as well. Companies across Germany, and this is a dimension of the history that post-war Germany was slow to fully confront, paid the SS a daily fee for the use of prisoner labor. The fee was modest. The labor was, by definition, forced. The conditions under which the laborers worked ranged from harsh to deadly, and the SS, through offices like the WW2 that Kammler served, managed the allocation and administration of this labor as a profit center, returning revenue to the SS's own accounts and indirectly to the Reich treasury. The concentration camp system was not just a system of punishment and murder, it was a business. Kammler engaged with this business at its most consequential scale. His construction operations consumed prisoner labor in quantities that exceeded what most other SS projects required, because the projects themselves, the underground factories, the expanded camp infrastructure, the dispersal sites for advanced weapons production, were of a scale that demanded tens of thousands of workers operating continuously. At Mittelbau-Dora, the peak labor force reached approximately 32,000 prisoners, working in 2 shifts through the day and night, building V-2 rockets in tunnel conditions that killed them steadily and, in the early months, quickly. The death rate in the Dora tunnels in the winter of 1943-44, before any surface housing had been built and workers were living in the tunnels themselves, was extraordinary even by the standards of a system where death was ubiquitous. People died of exhaustion, of respiratory illness, of beatings, of the cumulative effect of cold and hunger and chemical exposure. They died while drilling rock. They died while pouring concrete. They died while assembling the components of rockets that would fall on cities whose inhabitants had never heard of Mittelbau-Dora and would not learn about it for decades. The practical management of this labor force required a substantial administrative apparatus, and Kammler ran it with the precision that characterized everything he did. The allocation of prisoner workers between competing projects was a constant source of internal SS politics. Different construction programs competed for the same limited pool of available labor, and the resolution of these competitions depended on the relative priority that the regime assigned to each project. Mediated through the offices of the WW2, Kammler, as the chief of Office C, was one of the key decision-makers in these allocations. He could direct labor toward a high-priority project and away from a lower-priority one. He could request additional prisoners from the camp system when a project fell behind schedule. He could, and did, order the transfer of prisoners between locations when the operational needs of his empire required it. These transfers were not made with any consideration for the health or welfare of the prisoners being moved. They were made on the basis of construction schedules and production targets. The human cost was not a variable in Kammler's calculations. Alongside the prisoner labor, Kammler's construction empire also used what the SS called civilian foreign workers, people from occupied territories who had been conscripted or coerced into labor service, and who lived in conditions that, while often better than those of concentration camp prisoners, still constituted forced labor in any meaningful legal or moral sense. The combination of prisoner labor, foreign workers, and diminishing numbers of German civilian workers created a labor force of considerable size and complexity, spread across construction sites that ranged from the tunnels of the Harz Mountains to the plains of occupied Poland to the industrial regions of France and the Netherlands. Managing this workforce, coordinating its allocation, and maintaining the construction schedules that the regime's weapons programs demanded was a genuinely complex administrative task. And Kammler, whatever his moral failings, was genuinely competent at it in a technical sense. The underground factories were built, the rockets were produced, the construction projects were completed. The SS Empire was real, and it worked, in the narrow sense that large-scale forced labor construction programs can be said to work precisely because Kammler ran it with the cold efficiency of a man who had never allowed any consideration except operational effectiveness to enter his thinking. The conditions at the various construction sites under Kammler's authority varied, but the variation was largely a matter of degree rather than kind. At some sites, the death rate was lower, at others, catastrophically high. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, where Kammler's construction teams had built the facilities and where a large labor force of prisoners was engaged in ongoing construction work alongside the extermination operations, the death rate was shaped by the entire brutal context of a camp that was simultaneously a labor facility and an extermination center. At Mittelbau-Dora, as noted, the death rate in the early months was severe enough to attract notice even within the SS, not out of humanitarian concern, but because workers were dying faster than production could justify. At a construction project at Gussenwerk, near Linz in Austria, another underground facility for the dispersed production of advanced weapons components, conditions were described by survivors as among the worst they had encountered anywhere in the camp system. The pattern was consistent. Wherever Kammler's construction empire operated, the human cost was high, the conditions were degrading, and the administrative response to worker deaths was a request for replacement workers rather than an investigation into causes. Post-war testimony from survivors of the various sites in Kammler's construction empire is extensive and has been compiled by historians over the decades since the war. The testimonies describe, with a specificity that makes them difficult to read, even at a distance of more than 80 years, the daily reality of life under the construction regime that Kammler managed: the cold, the hunger, the arbitrary violence of guards, the collapse of physical strength under workloads that were designed for a full-strength adult male and were applied equally to people who were starving, the sight of fellow prisoners dying and being carried away, their deaths noted in administrative logs, and their numbers replaced by the next transport from the next camp. These testimonies are not abstract. They name individuals. They describe specific incidents at specific locations on specific days. They constitute a record that is, in aggregate, a testimony against one man's administrative choices as much as they are a testimony about the system those choices served. The private industry dimension of Kammler's slave empire is a subject that deserves extended treatment, and it is one that post-war Germany was slow to fully confront. Companies that are today household names, companies whose products are bought in shops across the world, used SS prisoner labor in their wartime production facilities. They paid the SS for the privilege. They received the labor. They knew the conditions under which their workers lived. In some cases, company records survive that document this relationship with a clarity that makes the company's subsequent claims of ignorance or innocence difficult to sustain. Kammler, as the administrator of the SS's construction empire, was the institutional link between the camps that supplied the labor and the projects that consumed it. His office negotiated the rates, managed the allocations, tracked the productivity, and handled the administrative paperwork when workers died. He was not a distant figure in this process. He was its operational core. In the post-war reckoning, this dimension of Kammler's responsibility was largely overlooked. The Nuremberg trials addressed the leadership of the Nazi regime at a level of generality that left many of the mid-level administrators, the men who ran the actual machinery of the system, rather than devising its ideology, outside the reach of prosecution. Kammler was declared dead and therefore never tried. The WW2 trial at Nuremberg, one of the 12 subsequent trials held under Allied authority, addressed Oswald Pohl and other senior SS administrators, but Kammler's absence from the proceedings meant that his specific role in the construction empire was never formally examined in the context of a criminal tribunal. His crimes were real, documented, and monstrous in their scale, but because he was legally dead, or because he was somewhere that made his prosecution inconvenient, the accountability that his record demanded was never delivered. The legacy of the slave labor empire that Kammler administered is not abstract, it is physical. The tunnels of Mittelwerk are still in the earth of the Harz Mountains, though access to them was restricted for decades, and the site remained contaminated for years after the war. The memorial at Mittelbau-Dora, established in the 1960s in what was then East Germany, documents the names and fates of the people who died there, maintaining the record that Kammler's administrative system once kept in a very different spirit. The blueprints that Kammler signed, the construction orders that bore his name, are in archives in several countries, available to researchers who know where to look. The architecture of the camps he built is gone, in most cases, demolished, either during the war in the chaotic retreat or afterward by governments that found the physical structures too difficult to face. But the record of what stood there and what happened there and who built it endures. Hans Kammler built things designed to last. What has lasted, against his probable intentions, is the memory of what those things were for. Chapter 9. The Intelligence Hunt. What America Knew and When, In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces crossed into Germany from both east and west, a different kind of operation was running alongside the conventional military advance, quieter, faster, and in some ways more consequential for the decades that followed. Teams of scientists, intelligence officers, and specialists in fields ranging from aeronautics to nuclear physics were moving behind the combat units with specific missions: to find German technical installations before the Soviets could reach them, to secure documents and equipment before they could be destroyed, and to identify and collect the German scientists and engineers whose knowledge, abstracted from the ideological context that had produced it, represented a resource of incalculable strategic value. This operation, pursued under various organizational frameworks and ultimately most recognizable under the name Operation Paperclip, was one of the most morally complicated things that the victorious Allied powers did in the immediate aftermath of the war. The ALSO's mission, which operated under the direct authority of the Manhattan Project's General Leslie Groves, was the most prominent of these scientific intelligence operations. Its focus was primarily nuclear. The Allied powers were desperate to learn how far the German nuclear weapons program had progressed, and to secure whatever nuclear materials and expertise remained in Germany before the Soviets could access them. But the mission's scope expanded as it became clear that Germany's advanced weapons programs extended well beyond the nuclear domain. The V2 program, the jet aircraft program, the guided missile programs, all of these fell within the broadening interest of American scientific intelligence, and the men pursuing them were operating with a speed and urgency that reflected a clear strategic priority. Winning the scientific and technical competition with the Soviet Union was, by the spring of 1945, already being treated as the next war's first battle. Hans Kammler sat at the intersection of everything these intelligence operations were looking for. He was not a scientist himself, but he was something arguably more valuable in the short term: the administrator who knew where everything was. He knew the locations of the underground factories. He knew where the V2 documents had been hidden, the 14 tons of technical files that American teams eventually recovered from a mine near Nordhausen, files that provided the foundational documentation for the American ballistic missile program. He knew the whereabouts of key personnel. He knew the details of programs that were still only partially visible to Allied intelligence from aerial reconnaissance and signals intercepts. He was, in the context of the intelligence hunt that was underway in those chaotic weeks, a master key, and the question that historians have been asking ever since is whether the Americans used him. The evidence, as assembled from the fragmentary record that survives, suggests that they did, at least partially. The November 1945 interrogation order from Brigadier General MacDonald, directing the interview of Kammler with specific interest in underground installations, is the most unambiguous piece of evidence that Kammler was alive and accessible to American intelligence at least 6 months after his alleged suicide. It is a document in the official military record. It carries proper authorization. It names Kammler specifically as the subject of interrogation. The only interpretation that does not require some form of official deception is that Kammler was alive and in American custody, or at least in American reach, in the autumn of 1945, and that whoever issued the interrogation order knew this. The CIC report that described Kammler's appearance at the American Counterintelligence Corps facility at Gmunden, a town in the Austrian Salzkammergut region, well within the American occupation zone, is similarly direct. The report does not hedge. It states that Kammler appeared and gave a statement. The subject of that statement, operations at Ebensee, according to the document, was consistent with what Kammler would have known and what American intelligence would have wanted to know. The Ebensee facility, a subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria, had been used for the production of advanced weapons components, under conditions that, by the time American forces liberated it in May of 1945, had reduced the prisoner population to a state of near-total physical collapse. American soldiers who entered Ebensee on the 6th of May 1945 described what they found in terms that became some of the most disturbing testimonies of the liberation period. Kammler, as the administrative authority over the facility, would have had information about its operations that American investigators needed and did not yet have. The question of whether Kammler made a deal, whether his knowledge was exchanged for some form of protection or immunity, depends on evidence that either no longer exists or has not yet been made public. The pattern of redactions in the American files that Dean Reuter obtained through his Freedom of Information requests is, at minimum, suggestive of deliberate removal of material. Files on Operation Paperclip scientists are typically heavily populated. Personnel records, interview transcripts, employment histories, security assessments. Kammler's file, if a comprehensive one ever existed, appears to have been reduced to something that tells almost nothing. This is consistent with deliberate cleaning, as the archivist apparently suggested to Reuter. It is also consistent with the possibility that records were filed under a different name, an operational alias that Kammler may have been given or assumed, and have not yet been identified and connected to his true identity. The Soviet dimension of the intelligence competition adds another layer of complexity. The Soviets were conducting their own parallel operation to collect German scientific and technical expertise, and they were doing so with the full force of the NKVD and its successor organs. In the sectors of Germany that came under Soviet occupation, German scientists and engineers were recruited, sometimes forcibly, into Soviet programs. The Soviet ballistic missile program, which eventually produced the rockets that put the first satellite and the first human into space, drew substantially on captured German V2 hardware, documentation, and personnel. The Soviets captured the Mittelwerk facility itself, briefly, before it was transferred to the American zone. They stripped whatever they could find before withdrawing. They did not capture the core personnel or the key documentation. The Americans had moved faster, but they had their own sources, and their own networks, and their own interest in what Kammler knew. Whether Kammler feared the Soviets more than the Americans, and whether that fear drove his apparent movement toward the American occupation zone in the final days of the war, is a question that the evidence permits but does not answer. He had good reason to fear both powers. The Soviets, whose prisoner populations had suffered under his construction regime in ways that were documented and known to the relevant Soviet intelligence organs, would not have been inclined toward accommodation. The Americans were more ambiguous, capable, as Operation Paperclip demonstrated, of setting aside a man's wartime record in exchange for technical knowledge, but only if the technical knowledge was sufficiently valuable and only if the political risk of the accommodation could be managed. For scientists like von Braun, the calculation worked. The technical knowledge was real, the post-war narrative was manageable, and the ideological compromises were papered over with carefully worded security assessments. For Kammler, the calculation was more complicated. He was not primarily a scientist. He was an administrator of atrocity. His knowledge was operational and logistical, not scientific, and the scale of what he had personally administered, the death camps, the slave factories, the construction orders with his signature, was harder to fold into a narrative of benign technical transfer. And yet the interrogation order exists. The CIC report exists. The empty files exist. Something happened between Hans Kammler and the American intelligence apparatus in the spring and summer and autumn of 1945, and whatever it was, it has not been fully disclosed. The most measured conclusion that the available evidence supports is that Kammler did have contact with American intelligence, that those contacts involved the exchange of information, and that the subsequent handling of Kammler, whether he was briefly interviewed and then released to his own fate, whether he was held in custody and died there, whether he was given some form of passage out of the reach of war crimes investigators, was managed in a way that left the minimum possible documentary trace. The men who managed that handling knew what they were doing. The trace they left was not an accident. The intelligence hunt of 1945 was not a story with a clean moral. It was a story about the collision between the urgent strategic priorities of a new global competition and the unfinished moral accounting of a war that had produced crimes on a scale the world had never seen before. In that collision, some of the architects of those crimes were quietly absorbed into the institutional machinery of the powers that had defeated them. Their records adjusted or removed, their subsequent lives conducted under the protective shadow of classified files. Whether Kammler was one of those men, whether he walked out of history with American help, or Soviet help, or simply on his own, remains one of the Second World War's most genuinely unresolved questions. And the fact that it remains unresolved, more than 80 years later, is itself a kind of answer about the nature of the institutions involved. Chapter 10. The Nuremberg Shadow, Why He Was Never Tried. On the 20th of November, 1945, less than 7 months after the end of the war in Europe, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg opened its proceedings against 24 of the highest-ranking surviving members of the Nazi regime. The trial was, in many ways, a remarkable achievement, the first time in history that the leaders of a defeated nation were held to account in an international court for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecutors were American, British, French, and Soviet. The defendants included men who had shaped the war's course from its very beginning: Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Frank, Streicher, Speer, and others. The proceedings lasted nearly a year. They produced a body of documentation and testimony that became the foundational archive of the Holocaust. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death, 7 received prison terms, 3 were acquitted. Hans Kammler was not in the dock at Nuremberg. He was, officially, already dead. The court that had issued his death declaration the previous September had resolved, at least for legal purposes, the question of his existence. There was no body to bring to trial, no living defendant to sit in the glass booth and answer the questions that the prosecution had assembled its evidence to ask. And so the man who had signed the construction orders for Auschwitz-Birkenau, who had overseen the building of Mittelbau-Dora, who had directed the demolition of the Warsaw Ghetto, who had built the slave labor empire that produced the V2 rockets, that man was simply absent from the most significant legal reckoning with Nazi crimes that the world had ever conducted. The absence was not just Kammler's personal good fortune, if fortune is the right word for whatever mechanism kept him out of that courtroom. It was a structural gap in the Nuremberg proceedings that had consequences for the historical record. The WW2, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials conducted by American military tribunals between 1946 and 1949, did address the SS's administrative apparatus, including the concentration camp system and the forced labor programs. Oswald Pohl, Kammler's superior and the head of the WW2, was tried and convicted and eventually executed. Other senior WW2 officials received prison terms, but the testimony and evidence assembled for those trials was necessarily shaped by who was present and available to testify and to be cross-examined. Kammler's absence left a specific gap in the prosecution's ability to reconstruct the construction division's activities with the precision that his direct testimony would have allowed. This structural gap was noticed at the time. Allied prosecutors working on the WW2 case were aware that Kammler had been one of the most senior and most operationally significant figures in the SS construction empire, and that his absence meant a significant portion of that empire's activities would have to be reconstructed from documents and from the testimony of subordinates, rather than from the direct examination of the man at the center. Documents were available. Kammler had left an extensive paper trail, as detailed administrators tend to do, but documents have limitations that testimony can sometimes overcome. The construction orders prove what was built. They prove less clearly about the chain of decisions that led to specific design choices, the internal discussions about operational parameters, the degree to which specific individuals understood and endorsed the purposes that the facilities they were building would serve. Albert Speer's testimony at the main Nuremberg trial is worth examining in this context, because Speer's relationship with Kammler was a significant dimension of the wartime administrative history that the trial was trying to illuminate. Speer was the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, nominally Kammler's superior in some areas of weapons production, actually his bureaucratic rival in others, and a man who had watched Kammler accumulate power with what he later described as a combination of alarm and grudging admiration. At Nuremberg, Speer presented himself as a technocrat who had been focused on production and largely ignorant of the crimes that the system he served was committing. This defense was not fully believed by the tribunal. He received a 20-year prison sentence rather than acquittal, but it was sufficiently credible to save his life. In his testimony, Speer described Kammler in terms that made clear how significant a figure he had been, and how the SS general's rise had progressively displaced conventional military and ministerial authority in the most advanced sectors of German weapons production. What would Kammler's own testimony at Nuremberg have revealed? This is necessarily speculation, but it is informed speculation, grounded in what we know about his role and about the gaps in the Nuremberg record. He could have testified, directly and from personal knowledge, about the decision-making processes within the WW2 that led to the specific design of the extermination facilities at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He could have described the chain of command that connected the construction decisions to the ideological directives that drove them, including, potentially, direct orders from Himmler and Hitler that are only partially visible in the surviving documentary record. He could have testified about the use of prisoner labor in the V-weapons program. Who knew, who authorized, what the conditions were, what happened to workers who could no longer perform. He could have illuminated the relationship between the SS construction empire and the private companies that used its prisoner labor. And he could have described, from the inside, the final weeks of the regime's collapse, who made which decisions, where things were hidden, what happened to documentation that would otherwise have been available to the tribunal. He did none of these things because he was not there, and his absence was either a matter of genuine death, a cyanide capsule in a Czech forest, or a matter of deliberate management by persons or agencies who had reasons of their own for keeping him out of that courtroom. The two possibilities are not equally supported by the evidence, but neither is entirely eliminated by it. What is certain is that his absence had consequences for the specific cases that were built without his testimony, for the historical record that was compiled without his direct account, and for the families of the people who died in the facilities he built, and who deserved to see the man who built them answer for what he had done. The broader question of post-war accountability for the Holocaust, who was tried, who was not, who was convicted, and at what sentences, is one that historians and legal scholars have been examining ever since Nuremberg. The trials were more significant as a historical act than as a comprehensive legal reckoning. Most of the men who participated in the machinery of the Holocaust were never tried at all, and many of those who were received sentences that seem, from the contemporary perspective, strikingly lenient given the scale of what had been done. The WW2 officials who received prison terms were, in many cases, released within a decade of their conviction, under the pressure of the early Cold War, which created political incentives for the rapid reintegration of West Germany into the Western Alliance, and, as a byproduct, for the shortening of the sentences of men whose incarceration had become diplomatically awkward. The legal reckoning that Nuremberg began was real and was important, but it was not complete, and Hans Kammler, the man whose signature was on the blueprints of Birkenau, was one of the most significant figures it never reached. The families of the people who died in Kammler's construction empire did not get to see him stand trial. The survivors who worked in the tunnels of Dora and the camps of Auschwitz did not get to watch him enter the dock. The prosecutors who assembled their cases from his paper trail did not get to cross-examine the man who had signed the orders, and the historical record, which is in one sense just a collection of documents and testimonies and the interpretations we build from them, has a specific shape that his absence from Nuremberg gave it. There are questions it cannot answer cleanly. There are chains of command it cannot fully reconstruct. There are decisions it can document but not illuminate from the inside. The gap where Kammler's testimony would have been is, 80 years later, still a gap. And in the silence of that gap, the mystery of what happened to him, and of what he knew, and what he told, and to whom, continues to echo. Chapter 11. The Theories. Death, Deal, or Escape, _. The history of Hans Kammler, after the 9th of May 1945, is, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a history of theories, not of established facts, not of documented certainties, a history of competing narratives, each with its own evidentiary basis, each pulling at a different thread in the same tangled story, and none of them arriving at an ending that the others cannot contest. This is unusual, even in the context of wartime disappearances, which are not uncommon. It is unusual because the quantity of suggestive but inconclusive evidence is so large, and because the people and institutions implicated in the competing theories are significant enough that the stakes of resolving the question feel, even now, more than academic. The first and official theory is the simplest. Hans Kammler died by his own hand, cyanide, on the 7th of May, 1945, somewhere in the territory of what was then German-occupied Bohemia, roughly in the area between Prague and the German border. This account rests on the sworn testimonies of two men who claim to have been present: Kurt Preuck, Kammler's personal driver, and Heinz Soiner, a wartime aide. Both men gave accounts that were broadly consistent with each other on the key facts: the date, the method, the approximate location. Neither account specified an exact location with enough precision to allow a search for physical evidence. No body was ever produced. No grave was ever found. No forensic investigation was ever conducted. The German court that accepted these testimonies and issued the death declaration in September of 1948 did so on the basis of witness statements alone, and those witnesses had obvious reasons to provide the account they gave, since confirming their superior's death by suicide effectively removed both themselves and him from the reach of war crimes investigators, who might otherwise have had questions for all three of them. Historians who have examined the Preucker and Soiner testimonies have been skeptical. The British historian and author Dean Reuter, who spent years investigating Kammler's fate, concluded that the testimonies were fictitious, a strong word in historical scholarship, but one that the evidence he assembled appears to support. The inconsistencies between different versions of the same account, the absence of any physical corroboration, and the documentary evidence of American intelligence interest in Kammler after the date of his alleged death all point in the same direction: that the official account of his death was constructed, deliberately, by people who had reasons to want him officially dead. Whether those reasons were personal, protecting themselves from the inquiries that a living Kammler would attract, or institutional, reflecting the interests of an organization that had made arrangements for him, is a question the testimonies themselves cannot answer. The second theory is the one that has attracted the most sustained attention from researchers: that Kammler surrendered to American intelligence and provided information, perhaps extensive information, about the locations of German technical assets, personnel, and documentation, in exchange for some form of protection. This theory is supported, as discussed in the previous chapter, by the November 1945 interrogation order, the CIC interview report, and the account of Donald Richardson's sons. It is consistent with the pattern of the Operation Paperclip program, which demonstrated that the American intelligence and scientific establishment was willing, in the immediate post-war period, to make accommodations for Germans with useful knowledge, regardless of their wartime records. And it is consistent with what we know about Kammler's character: a man who had spent his career identifying what powerful people needed and making himself the person who could provide it, would not, in the chaos of April and May 1945, have failed to calculate the value of his own knowledge to the Americans, who were moving through Germany, looking for exactly what he possessed. The difficulty with this theory is not that it is implausible, it is quite plausible, but that the documentary evidence for a formal deal is fragmentary and incomplete. The records that might confirm or deny a Kammler-American arrangement are either missing, redacted, or have not yet been identified and made public. Dean Reuter's experience with the Freedom of Information process, receiving heavily redacted documents and then being told, on a second request, that no records existed, is consistent with either deliberate removal or with misidentification and misfiling. Without a clear documentary foundation, the deal theory remains a well-supported hypothesis rather than a demonstrated fact. It may be that the full evidence exists in archives that have not yet been fully processed or declassified. It may be that it was destroyed. It may be that it was never created in a form that would survive the transition between wartime operational practice and the peacetime documentary record. The third theory, less discussed in mainstream historical scholarship but present in the more speculative literature, is that Kammler escaped to South America or another neutral country through one of the rat lines that did, demonstrably, facilitate the escape of a number of senior Nazis after the war. The rat lines, organized escape networks that routed fugitives through Italy using forged or legitimately obtained travel documents, and from there to destinations in South America, particularly Argentina, where the Perón government was generally receptive to German immigrants of a certain political background, were real. They were used. Named individuals who could be placed on them have been identified in archives in Argentina, Italy, and elsewhere. The question is whether Kammler used them. There is no specific documentary evidence placing him on a rat line. There are no Argentine immigration records that have been connected to him. The theory rests primarily on analogy. He could have done what others did, rather than on specific evidence that he did. That is not nothing, but it is not enough to establish the theory as the most probable account of his fate. The fourth possibility, less a theory than a counterfactual, is that Kammler did die in the final days of the war, but not by suicide, in the manner that Preuck and Zeuner described. He could have been killed in the general fighting of those chaotic days. He could have been shot by one of his own men, the kind of extrajudicial killing that was not uncommon in the SS's final days, as men tried to eliminate those who might testify against them. He could have died of illness or injury in a way that left no recoverable record. The absence of a body does not, in the context of the war's final weeks, automatically imply survival. Hundreds of thousands of people died in those weeks, under circumstances that left no findable remains. But the accumulation of post-death evidence, the interrogation order, the CIC report, the Richardson account, makes this fourth possibility the hardest to sustain without dismissing a substantial body of suggestive evidence. What strikes researchers who have spent time with this question is not that any single theory is clearly right, but that the evidence has a specific shape. It consistently points toward American contact, consistently fails to produce a body, consistently shows signs of deliberate management. That itself tells a story about the kinds of decisions that were made in the chaos of 1945 by institutions and individuals who were operating under enormous pressure, with incomplete information, in a moral environment that was still being defined in real time. The decision to deal with a man like Kammler, if that decision was not made by monsters. It was made by pragmatists who believed, in the context of an emerging Cold War, that the strategic value of what Kammler knew outweighed the moral cost of keeping him out of the Nuremberg dock. Whether that calculation was right, or even coherent as a moral matter, is a judgment that belongs to the historians and the ethicists. The people who made it, if they made it, were doing what pragmatists do. They were choosing the outcome that served the most immediate strategic interest and dealing with the moral consequences later. For most of them, later appears never to have arrived. The families of those who died at Mittelbau-Dora, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, at Majdanek, at the dozens of other sites that Kammler's construction empire built and administered, those families did not have the luxury of pragmatism. They had only the fact of what had happened, the absence of accountability, and the slowly gathered documentation of the man who had built the machinery that killed their people. For them, the question of whether Kammler died in a forest or walked away under American protection was not an interesting historical puzzle. It was a question about whether the world that emerged from the Second World War was capable of justice, or whether justice, like so many other things in that extraordinary and terrible time, was simply one more resource to be allocated according to strategic need rather than moral debt. Chapter 12. The Forgotten Architect. Why History Looked Away, _ There is a particular kind of historical forgetting that is not passive. It does not happen simply because the record was incomplete or the witnesses have died. It happens because specific people made specific decisions that shaped which stories the post-war world would tell about itself and which stories it would quietly set aside. The forgetting of Hans Kammler, the near-total absence of his name from the popular historical memory of the Second World War for decades after its end, is a forgetting of this active kind. It was shaped by institutional decisions, by the priorities of post-war justice, by the strategic calculations of Cold War intelligence, and by the remarkable fact that the man most responsible for the physical infrastructure of the Holocaust had officially, legally, ceased to exist before the trials that might have kept his name alive in the public record had even begun. Consider, for a moment, what it means to say that Kammler is a forgotten figure. He is not entirely unknown to historians, specialist researchers who work on the SS's economic and administrative history, on the V-weapons program, on the construction of the concentration camps, have written about him for decades. His name appears in the scholarly literature, his signature appears in archival documents. The WW2 trial at Nuremberg referenced his role in the SS construction empire. But in the popular historical memory of the Second World War, the memory shaped by documentaries and books written for general audiences, by the narratives taught in schools and discussed in homes, he is almost entirely absent. He does not occupy the place in the popular imagination that his actual role in the events of the war would seem to demand. Part of the explanation for this absence is structural. The popular narrative of the Holocaust, necessarily simplified for mass audiences, tends to focus on the ideological architects, Hitler, Himmler, Eichmann, and on the final outcome, the scale of the murder, the liberation of the camps, the testimony of survivors. The intermediate layer of administrators and engineers, who translated ideology into physical infrastructure, occupies a less visible space in this narrative. Albert Speer, who was tried at Nuremberg and whose memoir became a widely read post-war document, is the exception who proves the rule. His visibility in the popular record is partly a product of his presence at the trial, his relatively articulate self-presentation, and the literary quality of his post-war account. Kammler had none of these things. He was declared dead before the trials began. He wrote no memoir. He gave no post-war interview that has ever been made public. He is a figure you have to go looking for, in archives and specialized histories, rather than one who presents himself in the mainstream record. But there is more to it than structure. The specific silence around Kammler has a quality that feels deliberate, or at least that is the impression of the researchers who have spent time with it. Dean Reuter describes the experience of investigating Kammler as repeatedly encountering walls where doors should be, files that should exist but don't, institutional memories that should reach him but stop just short, testimonies that are conveniently unanimous on the key facts and completely absent on the details that would allow verification. This pattern of obstruction, if that is what it is, could reflect the ongoing protection of operational secrets that are now more than 80 years old and long past any plausible current security relevance, or it could simply reflect the organic tendency of large institutions to preserve the form of their own narratives by burying the evidence that complicates them. The story of Wernher von Braun is instructive here, because it represents the visible end of the spectrum of which Kammler may represent the hidden end. Von Braun came to the United States under Operation Paperclip, had his SS membership and wartime record carefully adjusted in official documentation, and was reborn as an American hero, the technical genius who would eventually direct the Saturn V program and put human beings on the surface of the moon. The moral complexity of his wartime history, the SS rank, the Mittelbau-Dora knowledge, the rocket production that relied on slave labor, was not entirely suppressed, but it was managed, kept in the specialized literature, acknowledged quietly when pressed, but systematically kept out of the celebratory narrative of American space achievement. Only in later decades, and particularly after the collapse of the Cold War removed the strategic incentive for his protection, did a fuller and more complicated picture of von Braun's wartime record enter the mainstream discussion. If von Braun required that kind of historical management at the visible end of the spectrum, the question of what was required at the less visible end, where a man like Kammler, with a far more damning and far less scientifically productive record, might have been handled, is not one with an obvious answer. The Cold War context is essential here. By the time the Nuremberg trials concluded and the immediate post-war reckoning was wrapping up, the geopolitical context had shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union had tested its own nuclear device in August of 1949. The Berlin blockade had made clear that the division of Europe was not temporary. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, demonstrated that the Cold War could become hot with very little notice. In this environment, Western governments were increasingly focused on consolidating their technical and intelligence advantages over the Soviet Union, and decreasingly focused on the ongoing work of holding former Nazis accountable for wartime crimes. West Germany's integration into NATO in 1955 was accompanied by a general Western reluctance to press too hard on the denazification process, for fear of destabilizing a key Cold War ally. The legal proceedings that had continued through the late 1940s and early 1950s gradually slowed and then effectively stopped. The window of historical accountability, never as wide as the victims deserved, was closing. The organizations that had collected German scientists and engineers under paperclip had, by the early 1950s, largely achieved their objectives. The personnel they wanted were in American facilities, working on American programs. The institutional pressure to manage the record of what had been done to bring them there was, if anything, intensifying as the Cold War deepened, and the domestic political climate in the United States made associations with former Nazis increasingly sensitive. The management of that record, the careful pruning of what was officially documented, the informal understanding that certain files were not for general access, the gentlemen's agreements about what would and would not be said publicly about the wartime histories of certain individuals, was conducted by people who believed they were serving their country's interests. Many of them were right, in the narrow instrumental sense that the American space and missile programs did benefit enormously from the German expertise they imported. Whether the cost of that benefit, the suppression of accountability, the effective protection of men who had administered crimes against humanity, was proportionate to the gain, is a moral question that each generation has to answer for itself. The revival of serious historical interest in Kammler, which began to gather momentum in the first decade of the 21st century and accelerated significantly after the publication of Dean Reuter's book in 2020, is itself a kind of historical event. A signal that the combination of time and persistent research is, even in cases of deliberate obscuration, eventually capable of recovering at least the outlines of what was hidden. The documents that have emerged from archives in the United States, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom over the past 2 decades have not resolved the mystery of Kammler's fate, but they have significantly complicated the official narrative, the simple death by cyanide account that German courts accepted in 1948, and they have done so in ways that point toward American institutional involvement in whatever happened to him. This recovery of the historical record is, in part, the work of archivists and historians who have spent careers in the unglamorous business of reading documents and building cases from evidence that was never designed to be found. It is also, in part, a product of the natural declassification processes that eventually, slowly, incompletely, with many exceptions and exemptions still in place, make wartime intelligence records available to researchers. And it is, in part, a product of the families of survivors and victims who have maintained the pressure for accountability across generations, refusing to allow the gradual softening of memory to erase the specific names and the specific signatures that documented specific crimes. The name Hans Kammler belongs in the historical record of the Second World War, alongside the names that are more familiar, not because his story is more terrible than others, it is, in aggregate, not more terrible than the story of the regime he served, but because understanding how that regime worked, and how it was dismantled, and which parts of its machinery were preserved and transplanted and made useful to its conquerors, requires knowing who built that machinery and what happened to them afterward. Kammler built it, he signed it, and what happened to him afterward is a question that the historical record has not yet, finally and conclusively answered. Chapter 13. Operation Paperclip. The Science of Forgetting, __. In the months immediately following the German surrender, the United States government faced a dilemma that it has never fully resolved in the public record. A dilemma that sits at the intersection of strategic necessity, moral obligation, and institutional self-interest in a way that makes clean conclusions almost impossible. The dilemma was this: Germany possessed, in the summer of 1945, a generation of scientists and engineers whose knowledge was a decade ahead of anything the Western Allies had independently developed. That knowledge, in rocketry, in jet propulsion, in aerodynamics, in chemical engineering, in nuclear physics, was of direct and immediate relevance to the coming competition with the Soviet Union, which was already moving to collect the same expertise from its own side of the divided continent. The question the American government had to answer was not whether to collect this knowledge. That decision had already been made, operationally, before the fighting stopped. The question was what price it was willing to pay, in moral and historical currency, to do so. Operation Paperclip, the formal program that organized the transfer of German scientific personnel to the United States, has been documented in increasing detail since its declassification, and the picture that documentation reveals is not comfortable. The program was explicitly designed to circumvent the American government's own stated policy on the employment of former Nazis. President Truman had signed a directive specifically excluding from American employment any person who had been a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities, or an active supporter of Nazism or militarism. Operation Paperclip addressed this inconvenient directive by having the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the body overseeing the program, alter the security reports on its candidates, changing language that identified active Nazi Party membership or SS affiliation to language that described the same individuals as harmless technicians who had been political bystanders. The alterations were systematic. They were made by American government employees acting under institutional direction. They were, in the plainest sense of the word, falsifications of official records. Wernher von Braun's case is the most thoroughly documented example of this process, and it is instructive precisely because of its visibility. His SS rank, Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major, was a documented fact that appeared in captured German records. His presence at Mittelbau-Dora and his awareness of the conditions under which V2 production was carried out was a documented fact supported by multiple witnesses. His brief arrest in February of 1945 on charges that appeared to relate to defeatist conversations about post-war rocket development was a documented fact in German administrative records. All of these facts were available to the American officials processing his case. All of them were, in various ways, adjusted, minimized, or omitted from the security assessment that cleared him for employment in the United States. The man who entered the American rocket program was not the same man on paper as the man who had existed in German records during the war. The gap between the two versions was a deliberate creation, constructed by an institution that had decided the strategic value outweighed the moral cost. For the scientists and engineers who came through the official paperclip program, this process produced a form of institutional protection that, while not absolute, was real and durable. The American government had a stake in their rehabilitation because it had a stake in their work. Discrediting them retroactively would have meant discrediting the programs they were building, which were programs of central importance to American national security. The incentive structure favored the maintenance of the adjusted narrative, and in the Cold War decades that followed, that narrative was largely maintained. Critics existed, investigative journalists, historians, survivors' organizations, who repeatedly drew attention to the gap between the official record and the wartime reality of specific paperclip scientists. But institutional inertia, classification, and the ongoing strategic value of the programs these men were building consistently blunted the force of those challenges. Hans Kammler's relationship to this institutional protection, if any such relationship existed, would have been of a fundamentally different character than von Braun's. Von Braun could be credibly presented as a scientist, a man whose primary identity was technical and whose wartime compromises could be framed, however inadequately, as the pragmatic accommodations of a man who wanted to build rockets and found himself in a political environment that required certain affiliations to do so. Kammler had no comparable narrative available to him. He was not a scientist. He was an administrator of atrocity, a man whose career consisted, in its most consequential chapters, of building death camps and slave labor factories. There was no version of his record that could be adjusted into something palatable for public consumption. Whatever use he was to the Americans had to be purely operational, information provided in private, under conditions that could be kept out of the documentary record. If a deal was made with Kammler, it was a deal of a kind that could never be disclosed, not even in the adjusted form that Paperclip used for its scientists. It was the kind of deal that required not adjustment, but erasure. This distinction is important because it shapes the kind of evidence we would expect to find if such a deal existed, and the kind of absence we would expect to find where that evidence should be. We would not expect to find Kammler in a paperclip personnel file with his SS rank adjusted out and his camp construction record minimized. That kind of paper trail, however falsified, was appropriate for men who were going to work publicly in American facilities. For Kammler, if there was a deal, we would expect to find exactly what we do find: an interrogation order that gestures at contact, a CIC report that records an interview without fully documenting its context or outcome, a family member's death declaration that moves with suspicious speed to legally close the question, and, at the center of it all, an absence, a set of files that should contain something and contain nothing. The shape of the absence is the evidence. You cannot always see what was removed, but you can sometimes see the space where it stood. The broader context of paperclip also illuminates why the American government's handling of post-war German expertise was, in some areas, managed below the level of formal institutional awareness. The program operated through a chain of authorization that was deliberately designed to keep certain decisions as far as possible from political oversight. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not to the State Department or to the civilian intelligence apparatus. Decisions about which Germans to collect, what to offer them, and how to manage the documentation of their wartime records were made by military intelligence professionals operating in an environment where the Cold War had already effectively redefined the moral calculus of the immediate post-war period. These were not rogue actors, they were people doing what their institutions trained them to do in the context of the strategic environment that surrounded them. Understanding this does not excuse the decisions they made. It explains the institutional logic that produced those decisions, which is a different thing. The families of Mittelbau-Dora victims, organized in associations that persisted through the post-war decades and into the 21st century, have consistently pressed for fuller disclosure of the American government's relationship with the men responsible for the camp's construction and operation. Their requests have been met with the same combination of partial response and persistent obstruction that characterizes the Kammler files specifically. The documents that have been released do not tell the whole story. The documents that have not been released, that may no longer exist, or may exist under classification authorities that have not yet been fully addressed, presumably tell more of it. 80 years on, the question of what was done, by whom, and under what authorization, in the handling of Hans Kammler and the institutional secrets he carried, is still not closed. It is one of the most significant unresolved transparency questions in the modern history of American intelligence, precisely because the events it touches, the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, the founding of the American space and missile program, are of such historical consequence that they deserve a complete record. They have not yet received one. The irony at the center of the Operation Paperclip story, as it relates to Kammler, is this. The program was designed to give America a technological advantage in the Cold War, and by most measures, it succeeded. The American ballistic missile program, the space program, the development of advanced jet aircraft, all of these drew substantially on the German expertise that Paperclip imported. The Soviet Union, which ran its own parallel program of German expertise collection, achieved comparable results in its missile and space programs. The technological competition that Paperclip was designed to serve played out, broadly speaking, as its architects intended. What did not play out as intended, what went wrong, in the most fundamental moral sense, was the accounting. The men whose wartime records had been adjusted or erased were never fully called back to face what those records documented. The survivors and victims who deserved that accounting were, instead, offered the consolation of incomplete trials and missing files. And the man who had built the architecture of the Holocaust's physical form, if he survived, lived out whatever years remained to him in a silence that was not of his own making, but of an institution's. Chapter 14. The Family Left Behind. Jutta Kammler and the Widow's Gambit, _. While historians and intelligence analysts wrestled with the question of what had happened to Hans Kammler, his family was left to navigate a post-war Germany that was simultaneously rebuilding and reckoning, a country that needed to function and to remember at the same time, and that found both tasks harder than either the optimists or the pessimists had predicted. The story of Jutta Kammler and her children is, in its own way, a microcosm of the broader story of the families of the Nazi elite, people who had lived comfortable lives in the shadow of monstrous authority and who now had to find a way to exist in a world that had turned that authority into a crime. Jutta Kammler, née Bartsch, had married Hans in 1932, just as his career was beginning its ascent through the Nazi state's administrative apparatus. They had 6 children together, born across the 1930s and 40s, spanning the full arc of the regime, from its triumphal early years to its catastrophic collapse. What Jutta knew about her husband's work, about the construction projects he oversaw, the camps he built, the slave labor empire he administered, is a question that the historical record does not answer with certainty. She was not a public figure. She left no memoir, no extended interview, no documentary record that would allow a direct examination of her awareness and her moral situation. What she left was a legal document, the petition for a declaration of death, submitted to the District Court of Berlin-Charlottenburg in the summer of 1945, just weeks after the war's end. The speed of that petition is one of the more striking details in the Kammler story. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May. Jutta Kammler's petition was filed, by most accounts, within approximately 2 months of that date, before the dust of the collapse had settled, before the scope of the post-war legal reckoning was clear, before most people in her situation had had time to understand the full dimensions of what the coming years would demand of them. The petition was accompanied by sworn statements from Pruyok and Zoyner, Kammler's driver and aide, who testified to the suicide on the 7th of May. The court accepted these testimonies and issued the death declaration, the legal mechanism that would have kept Kammler's name alive in the accountability process, keeping him a living wanted person rather than a legally dead private citizen, was thus closed with extraordinary efficiency. Some researchers have read the speed and smoothness of this process as itself meaningful. The logistics required to assemble and file a formal death petition within weeks of the war's end, in a country whose administrative infrastructure was in chaos, whose courts were operating under Allied authority, and whose legal procedures for exceptional circumstances like this had not yet been fully established, were not trivial. Someone with knowledge of the relevant procedures had to advise on the process. Someone with access to Pruyok and Zoyner had to coordinate their testimonies. The coherence and speed of the whole operation suggests either remarkable personal initiative by a woman acting alone, or some form of external assistance, from lawyers, from surviving SS networks, from someone with an interest in ensuring that the death declaration was issued quickly and on the basis of evidence that courts would accept without extensive scrutiny. The SS support networks that functioned in post-war West Germany, organizations like Stille Hilfe, the Silent Help Society that provided legal and financial assistance to the families of imprisoned or deceased SS members, are a documented reality that the post-war German state was slow to address. These networks maintained connections between the scattered survivors of the SS hierarchy, helped families navigate denazification processes, and, in some cases, assisted in the management of legal matters that directly bore on the accountability questions that the Allied occupation authorities were pressing. Whether Jutta Kammler had access to such networks, and whether any such network assisted in the preparation of her death petition, is not documented in the available record. It is, however, a possibility that the historical context makes entirely plausible. For the children, the legacy of the Kammler name was a burden of a kind that has few equivalents. They were born into a family whose father had, as the historical record slowly and painfully established, played a central role in building the physical infrastructure of one of the greatest crimes in human history. They had not chosen that father. They had not chosen that history. And yet the history attached to the name they carried was not something that private choice could simply remove. The post-war world had a particular way of handling the children of Nazi officials, generally with a combination of official denazification processes that addressed the parents rather than the children, and an informal social pressure that tended toward either enforced silence or, in some cases, a kind of collective amnesia that served nobody well in the long term. The most remarkable figure among Kammler's children is his son Jörg, whose trajectory represents one of the most extraordinary personal responses to paternal legacy in the post-war record. Jörg Kammler became a scholar, specifically a political scientist who devoted significant portions of his academic career to the study of anti-Nazi resistance movements in Germany. He published academic work on the history of German resistance to the National Socialist regime. He engaged publicly with questions of German historical responsibility. He took the name that had appeared on SS construction orders for death camps and attached it to work that was, in its intellectual orientation, a direct repudiation of everything that name had once represented. Whether this constituted a full moral reckoning, whether academic work on resistance movements can be a sufficient personal accounting for the paternal inheritance of Auschwitz-Birkenau's blueprints, is a question that belongs to each reader's own moral framework. What it undeniably represents is a conscious and active choice to confront rather than suppress. The other Kammler children chose, by most accounts, the path of silence and erasure, changing their relationship to the family name, living private lives that deliberately avoided the public exposure that would have connected them to their father's history. This too was a choice, and a human one, the choice of people who had no direct responsibility for what a parent had done, and who found, entirely understandably, that a life lived under that shadow was not a life they could sustain. The judgment of history is difficult to apply cleanly to people who were children during the events in question, and who had no agency in the decisions that produced their inheritance. But their silence also means that another potential source of information about Hans Kammler's fate, whatever their mother told them, whatever documents or communications they may have had access to, remains unavailable to the historical record. Jutta Kammler herself died in 1982, without having publicly discussed her husband's wartime career or the circumstances of his disappearance. Whatever she knew, and it is difficult to believe that the wife of a man in Kammler's position knew nothing about the nature of his work, even if she was insulated from its most brutal specifics. She took with her the legal death declaration she had obtained in 1948 stood. It was never formally contested. It gave Hans Kammler the legal status of a dead man who had never been tried, never been convicted, never been required to account for what his signature on those construction orders represented to the people who died in the facilities they authorized. The story of the Kammler family is, ultimately, a story about inheritance, the kind of inheritance that cannot be managed by denying it, that persists regardless of name changes or deliberate silence, that shapes the lives of people who had no hand in creating it. The families of the people who died in Kammler's construction empire had their own inheritance: grief, absence, the knowledge of how their parents and grandparents and siblings died, carried forward through generations that had to find a way to live alongside that knowledge. These two inheritances, the perpetrator's family and the victim's family, are connected by the same history, the same documents, the same signature on the same construction orders. Neither family chose their connection to that history, both carry it. The difference is that one carries it in a position of relative privacy and privilege, while the other carries it as a wound that the historical record has been, for too long, insufficiently diligent in fully documenting. Chapter 15. The Survivors Speak. Testimony. From the Tunnels. The most important voices in the history of Hans Kammler are not the voices of the historians who have reconstructed his career from archival documents, nor the voices of the intelligence analysts who have pieced together the fragments of his post-war fate. The most important voices are the ones that came from inside the tunnel, from Mittelbau-Dora, from Auschwitz-Birkenau, from Mauthausen-Ebensee, from the dozens of sites where his construction empire consumed human lives in the production of its projects. These voices were recorded, painstakingly, by historians and memorial institutions across the post-war decades. They are the testimony against which every other part of this story must ultimately be measured. The early months of Mittelbau-Dora, roughly from September of 1943 to the spring of 1944, before surface housing was constructed and prisoners were forced to live inside the tunnels in which they worked, produced some of the most harrowing survival testimony of the entire war. Yves Bayonne, a French political prisoner who survived Dora, later wrote about the tunnel experience in terms that the passage of decades had not softened. He described the darkness, the chalk dust that settled on everything and everyone, the cold that came not from external weather, but from the earth itself, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from working in a space where the air is always wrong, too little oxygen, too much chemical contamination, the lungs never quite getting what they need. He described men dying not dramatically but incrementally, losing their capacity for basic physical function over days and weeks, until they simply stopped being able to continue and were either beaten for stopping or carried away. Albert van Dijk, a Dutch prisoner who survived Dora and gave testimony to historical researchers in the post-war decades, described the roll calls, the twice-daily assemblies at which prisoners were counted with the same precision that characterized every other administrative function of the camp system. The roll calls were held regardless of weather, regardless of the physical condition of the assembled prisoners, regardless of how long they took. If the count did not match, the assembly continued until it did. Prisoners who had died during the shift were carried out and propped up at roll call so that the numbers would balance. The administrative requirement for numerical accuracy, the same precision that Kammler applied to his construction schedules, was applied equally to the counting of the living and the dead. The testimony of Jean-Michel, another French survivor of Dora, provided some of the most specific and damning details about the working conditions in the tunnels and about the treatment of prisoners who failed to meet production quotas. In his post-war account, he described the capos, the prisoner trustees who supervised work gangs, as operating under constant pressure from SS guards to maintain production rates, and transmitting that pressure downward onto the workers under their supervision in forms that ranged from verbal abuse to physical violence. The relationship between the SS administrative expectations, the production schedules set by Kammler's office and transmitted through the camp hierarchy, and the daily violence of the tunnel workplace was direct and documentable. The targets required a pace of work. The pace of work required enforcement. The enforcement produced violence. The chain was unbroken from the construction order to the individual blow. The survivors who testified about Auschwitz-Birkenau, and their number is very large, their collective testimony constituting one of the most extensively documented bodies of witness account in the history of human rights, described the physical environment of the camp in ways that gave specific and terrible meaning to the construction documents that bore Kammler's signature. The layout of the barracks, the positioning of the electrified fence, the arrangement of the crematoria in relation to the gas chambers. These were details that survivors remembered precisely because their lives depended on understanding the geography of the place. Every architectural decision that Kammler's office had made was experienced, by the people inside the camp, as an element of the physical world that defined the terms of their survival. The barrack capacity that the construction documents specified as an engineering parameter was lived by prisoners as chronic overcrowding, inadequate ventilation, insufficient sanitation, and the specific social dynamics of extreme physical deprivation in confined space. The testimony of Rudolf Vrba, who escaped from Auschwitz in April of 1944 and provided the first detailed eyewitness account of the camp's extermination operations to reach the Western Allies, described with remarkable precision the physical layout of the Birkenau crematoria, the same facilities whose design specifications appear in construction documents approved by Kammler's office. Vrba's account, compiled with Alfred Wetzler into what became known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report, provided dimensions, locations, and operational details that corresponded closely to the construction records subsequently recovered from German archives. The convergence of the survivor testimony and the administrative documentation was not coincidental. It was confirmation that what Kammler had built was what the survivors described, that the construction records and the testimony were describing the same physical reality from opposite sides of the administrative wall. Beyond the individual testimonies, the aggregate data compiled by memorial institutions and historians over the post-war decades gives a quantitative picture of the human cost of Kammler's construction empire. At Mittelbau Dora, roughly 60,000 prisoners passed through the camp over its period of operation, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 of them. Historical estimates vary, depending on how deaths are categorized and attributed, died there, from exhaustion, disease, beatings, hanging, and the cumulative effect of the conditions Kammler's administrative priorities had created. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, The aggregate death toll across the camp complex's operation from 1940 to 45 has been estimated by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum at approximately 1.1 million people, with more than 900,000 of them being Jews from across occupied Europe. The construction of the facilities that enabled this toll bore Kammler's name in the archived records. At Majdanek, at Sobibor, at the dozens of lesser-known subcamps of Kammler's construction empire, additional tens of thousands died. The totality of the death toll attributable, in a direct and documentable way, to the infrastructure that Kammler built and managed, is a number that resists easy comprehension. It is easier and more honest to remember it as specific people, as Yves Bayonne and Albert van Dyck and Jean-Michel and Rudolf Frober and the millions whose names did not survive into the record, than as a statistic. The connection between the survivor testimony and the administrative record is not just historical, it is legal and moral. In the trials that have continued to address Holocaust-era crimes over the decades since Nuremberg, in the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, in the ongoing prosecution of concentration camp guards in Germany in recent decades, survivor testimony has functioned as the essential human dimension of a historical case that would otherwise risk collapsing into a purely bureaucratic exercise in document analysis. The testimony does what the documents cannot. It insists on the humanity of the victims, on the reality of the experience behind the administrative language, on the connection between the signed order and the suffering it produced. In the case of Kammler, whose administrative record is extensive and whose personal absence from any courtroom is total, the survivor testimony carries an additional weight. It is the only form of direct witness to his empire that was ever publicly presented. He never had to sit in a courtroom and listen to it. That asymmetry, the testimony given, the accused absent, is one of the most significant unresolved injustices of the post-war reckoning. The memorial institutions that maintain the survivor testimonies and the documentation of the camps perform a function that is both archival and moral. They keep the record open, they make it available to researchers and to the public. They resist the gradual erosion of specific memory into general historical impression that occurs, inevitably, as the distance between the present and the events grows. The Dora Mittelbau Memorial in Nordhausen, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, the Mauthausen Memorial in Austria, these institutions collectively hold the most direct and complete record of what Hans Kammler's construction empire was and what it did. They are the institutional embodiment of the principle that the story of what happened in those places is not available for the kind of management that was applied to intelligence files and death declarations. It is public, it is documented, it endures, and it carries the name of the man who built those places, whether or not that man was ever made to answer for it in the way that justice required. Chapter 16. The Researchers Who Refuse to Forget. Every unresolved historical mystery depends, for whatever partial resolution it achieves, on the persistence of a small number of people who are not willing to accept the official account and not willing to stop asking questions that the available evidence cannot yet fully answer. In the case of Hans Kammler, that persistence has been demonstrated by a handful of researchers, historians, journalists, legal investigators, and former intelligence professionals, who have spent significant portions of their careers prying at the edges of a story that powerful institutions had, over the decades, worked hard to keep contained. The first sustained scholarly attention to Kammler's role in the SS construction empire came from the historian Michael Thad Allen, whose work on the intersection of SS ideology and industrial organization placed Kammler at the center of the administrative history of both the Holocaust and the V-Weapons program. Allen's approach was methodological and archival, building his account from the documents that survived in German, American, and Polish archives, and his conclusions, while careful and precisely hedged, established clearly that Kammler was not a peripheral figure, but one of the most consequential administrators of the Nazi state's most destructive operations. Allen's work gave Kammler a place in the specialist historical literature that his absence from the mainstream popular record had previously denied him. It established the baseline from which subsequent researchers could proceed. The work of Dean Reuter and his co-authors, the direct investigation of Kammler's post-war fate, represents a different mode of research, less archival reconstruction of a known historical role, more active investigation of a genuinely unresolved question. Reuter came to the Kammler story from a legal and intelligence background, and his approach reflected those origins. The systematic collection of available evidence, the testing of competing hypotheses against that evidence, and the pursuit of new documentation through the formal mechanisms of freedom of information requests and institutional access. His book, published in 2020 under the title The Hidden Nazi, brought the question of Kammler's fate to a general audience for the first time, and the response it received, both in terms of readership and in terms of subsequent historical attention, suggested that the gap in the mainstream record around Kammler had been felt, even if not articulated, by people with a general interest in Second World War history. The German historian Rainer Kalsch, who has spent decades investigating the technical history of the German weapons programs and the SS's role in them, contributed important archival findings to the understanding of the underground construction projects under Kammler's authority. His work on the Mittelwerk and the related underground facilities helped establish the physical and administrative details of the slave labor construction empire in ways that connected the administrative record to the survivor testimony, building the kind of corroborated historical account that can withstand legal and scholarly scrutiny. Kalsch's findings also illuminated the degree to which the post-war treatment of the underground construction program, both in the immediate occupation period and in the decades of Cold War that followed, reflected specific institutional decisions about what would and would not be publicly documented. The Dora Mittelbau Memorial's own historical research department has been a persistent and important institutional advocate for the fullest possible documentation of the camp and its relationship to the wider SS construction empire. The memorial's researchers have worked to identify the names of the dead, to reconstruct the administrative chain of command that connected Kammler's office to the daily operations of the tunnel system, and to maintain the connection between the abstract administrative history and the specific human cost it represented. Their work has been both a scholarly contribution and a moral act, an institutional insistence that the historical record of what happened at Dora will not be reduced to a footnote in the triumphant narrative of the space age. The role of journalists in keeping the Kammler story alive across the decades deserves specific acknowledgement. Investigative journalism operates with a different evidentiary standard than academic history, and in the Kammler case, that difference has sometimes been a weakness, producing claims that outrun the available evidence. But journalism also moves faster than academic history, covers ground that academic publishing cycles cannot quickly reach, and maintains a relationship with the public interest in these questions that academic publishing does not always serve. The German investigative journalism that pursued the Kammler question in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly in the context of the broader examination of West Germany's handling of its Nazi past, helped keep the question alive during a period when academic interest had not yet fully mobilized around it. The legal researchers who pursued cases related to the SS construction empire, including prosecutors in Germany and Austria, who continued to bring cases against surviving concentration camp personnel well into the 21st century, worked with the Kammler documentation as part of the wider evidentiary context of the camp system's administration. These cases rarely named Kammler directly, since he was legally dead and could not be prosecuted, but the documentation of his role, the construction orders, the administrative communications, the planning documents, formed part of the broader evidentiary record that established the chain of command within which the defendants in these later cases had operated. His signature, in a legal sense, is present in many proceedings that never bore his name. The most recent wave of research, stimulated partly by Reuter's book and partly by the release of additional archival material in the 2010s and 20s, has begun to close some specific evidentiary gaps while opening new lines of inquiry. German historians working with newly accessible East German Stasi files, the intelligence records of the German Democratic Republic, which had its own reasons for investigating certain aspects of the SS's post-war history, have found material relevant to the Kammler question that was not previously part of the Western research consensus. American researchers working with National Archives materials that underwent declassification in the 2010s have identified documents that add detail to the picture of American intelligence interest in Kammler in the immediate post-war period. The picture remains incomplete, but it is more complete than it was 20 years ago, and the trajectory of research suggests it will be more complete still in the decades ahead. What this research community shares, across its disciplinary and national differences, is the conviction that the incompleteness of the Kammler record is not a natural state of affairs, not simply the result of wartime chaos and the passage of time, but a condition that was created, at least in part, by deliberate institutional choices. The research community's task, as its members understand it, is to work against those choices, to recover what can be recovered, to document what can be documented, and to maintain the pressure on institutions that have not yet fully opened their records to the scrutiny that history demands. This is slow work. It proceeds against resistance that, while no longer the active resistance of wartime secrecy, reflects the institutional inertia of organizations that have rarely found it convenient to revisit the decisions of their predecessors with the full transparency that accountability requires. But it proceeds, and in proceeding, it keeps open the possibility that the full story of Hans Kammler will eventually be told, not as a mystery that cannot be resolved, but as a history that was deliberately obscured and was, finally, recovered. Chapter 17. The Long Shadow. Kammler's Legacy in the Modern World. This is not a metaphor. The technologies that Kammler's slave empire helped produce, the ballistic missile, the jet aircraft, the dispersed underground production facility, became foundational elements of the post-war world in ways that their origins in atrocity rarely accompany in the popular understanding of where they came from and at what cost they were first built. The American ballistic missile program, the program that produced the weapons at the center of the Cold War's nuclear standoff, and eventually the rockets that carried human beings to the moon, drew directly and substantially on the V2 program that Kammler administered. The 14 tons of V2 technical documents recovered from the mine near Nordhausen, the more than 100 German scientists and engineers brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, many of them veterans of Peenemünde and the Mittelwerk production program, the physical hardware, the complete and near-complete missiles shipped to White Sands, New Mexico, for testing and analysis. All of these formed the foundation on which the American missile and space program was built in the years and decades that followed. The Saturn V rocket that carried the Apollo missions was not a simple evolutionary descendant of the V2. Decades of American engineering and scientific development intervened, but the genealogical connection is real and documented. The men who designed the Saturn V had worked on the V2. The institutional knowledge they carried had been formed in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, in conditions that Kammler's administrative priorities had created. The Soviet ballistic missile and space program has a parallel genealogy. The Soviets collected their own share of German V2 hardware, documentation, and personnel, and the early Soviet missile program drew on that material directly. The R-7 rocket, the vehicle that launched Sputnik and the first cosmonauts, was developed by teams that included German experts and drew on captured German documentation. Sergei Korolev, the Soviet Union's chief rocket designer, was deeply familiar with the V2 program and its technical details. The space race of the 1950s and 60s, the defining technological competition of the early Cold War, the event that produced the first human in space and the first human on the moon, was, in its technical foundations, a competition between two programs, both of which owed a significant portion of their initial capability to the same German source. The source was Peenemünde, the production facility was Mittelwerk, the administrator was Kammler. This genealogy carries a moral weight that has been acknowledged only partially and reluctantly in the official narratives of both the American and Soviet space programs. The celebration of human achievement in space, the astronauts, the cosmonauts, the moments of genuine triumph that the space race produced, sits in uneasy relation to the human cost of the program whose technology it inherited. The approximately 20,000 people who died at Mittelbau-Dora, producing the V2 rockets that became the technical ancestors of the space program, have been memorialized, carefully and with genuine moral seriousness, by the institutions that maintain the Dora Memorial. But the connection between their deaths and the subsequent technological achievements has never been fully integrated into the popular narrative of the space age. It remains a corrective footnote to a story that prefers to tell itself without it. The jet aircraft represents a parallel case. The Messerschmitt Me 262, production of which Kammler controlled in the final year of the war, was the world's first operational jet fighter, and the technical knowledge it embodied about jet propulsion, about swept-wing aerodynamics, about the integration of high-temperature materials into aircraft structures, was absorbed by both American and British aircraft development programs in the immediate post-war period. German aeronautical engineers who had worked on the Me 262 and related jet programs were among the most sought-after personnel in the Allied scientific collection effort. The jet age that transformed global aviation in the 1940s and 50s was, in part, a product of German wartime research that Kammler had overseen. The connection is diffuse and mediated by decades of subsequent independent development, but it is real. The underground construction concept, the dispersed, subterranean production facility, buried inside mountains to protect it from aerial bombardment, represented a genuine innovation in industrial architecture that was studied extensively by Allied military planners in the post-war period. The principles demonstrated at Mittelwerk that a fully functioning industrial production facility could be created underground at considerable depth, with adequate logistics, ventilation, and worker facilities, were applied to post-war planning for hardened military installations, nuclear weapons storage facilities, and command and control centers designed to survive nuclear attack. The Cold War's vast infrastructure of underground military installations owes a conceptual and practical debt to the Mittelwerk model, however indirectly and however much the intervening decades of engineering development have modified the specific technical approaches. This too is a part of Kammler's legacy, though it is not a part that any Cold War military planning document was likely to acknowledge. Beyond the technological legacy, there is a legal and institutional legacy to the Kammler story that has shaped the subsequent history of international justice. The failures of the post-war accountability process, the missing trials, the adjusted records, the death declarations without bodies, contributed to a broader conversation about the gaps in international law and in the practical enforcement of accountability for mass atrocity that has continued ever since. The International Criminal Court, created in 2002, represents one institutional response to the recognition that the Nuremberg framework was insufficient, that international justice needed a permanent, standing mechanism rather than ad hoc tribunals assembled in the aftermath of specific conflicts. The arguments made for the ICC's creation drew explicitly on the lessons of Nuremberg, including the lessons of who Nuremberg failed to reach and why. The treatment of German scientific expertise in the post-war period also had long-term consequences for the ethics of scientific practice that are still being worked through. The question of whether scientific knowledge, once created, can be abstracted from the moral context of its creation, whether the rocket science that emerged from Mittelbau-Dora is just rocket science, separable from the slave labor that produced it, is a question that philosophers and scientists have been debating since the war ended and have not resolved. The scientific community's treatment of the paperclip scientists, the decision to evaluate their subsequent work without systematic reference to the conditions under which they gained their expertise, established a precedent that made such abstraction professionally normative. Challenges to that precedent, when they came from outside the scientific community rather than within it. The physical traces of Kammler's empire persist in the European landscape in forms that vary from the carefully maintained memorial to the unacknowledged ruin. The tunnels of Mittelwerk, for decades after the war a contaminated and inaccessible site that sat within the Soviet occupation zone and then within East Germany, are now partly accessible to visitors through the Dora Memorial Complex. The physical space of the tunnels, their scale, their darkness, the particular quality of the air inside them, remains as a kind of material testimony that no document can fully replicate. You can read about what happened at Dora, you can stand in the space where it happened and feel something different, The difference is not irrational. It is the difference between knowledge and witness, between history as information and history as presence. Kammler's legacy, in the end, is not a single thing. It is a set of connections between events and institutions and technologies that the conventional narratives of the post-war world have preferred to keep separated. Connecting them does not diminish the genuine achievements of the space age or the genuine courage of the astronauts and cosmonauts who risked their lives in it. It does insist that those achievements be understood in their full context, that the price paid for the technical foundation on which they rested was paid not by the governments that celebrated them, but by the men and women and children who died in the tunnels and the camps of Hans Kammler's construction empire. Remembering that price is not an act of historical pessimism, it is an act of historical honesty, and historical honesty, applied consistently and without exception to the records of the powerful and the testimony of the powerless alike, is the only foundation on which genuine understanding can be built. Chapter 18. The Verdict of History, Justice, Memory, and the Open File, _ Every story of this kind, the story of a man who built the architecture of atrocity and then stepped out of the historical record before justice could reach him, eventually has to confront the question of what we do with the absence of a final verdict. Courts exist to render judgments. History, which proceeds without subpoena power or rules of evidence in the legal sense, renders something different. Not a verdict, exactly, but an accounting, a record of what was done, by whom, and at what cost, an assessment of whether the mechanisms that were supposed to produce accountability functioned as they were designed to function, and if not, why not, and at whose instigation. This final chapter is that accounting, not for Hans Kammler alone, but for the system of decisions and silences that allowed him to occupy, in the popular historical memory, a space so much smaller than his actual historical significance. The historical record of Hans Kammler's role in the Second World War is, at this point, sufficiently documented to support a clear account of what he did. He was born in Stettin in the first year of the 20th century. He studied engineering, earned a doctorate, and joined the Nazi Party 2 years before it came to power, not as a follower of the crowd, but as a committed believer. He joined the SS, moved through its administrative apparatus, and became, in the critical years of 1942 and 43, the chief of the organization responsible for building the physical infrastructure of the Holocaust. He signed the orders for the construction of Auschwitz-Birkenau, he designed the expansion of the crematoria, he oversaw the construction of Majdanek, he directed the demolition of the Warsaw Ghetto, he built Mittelbau Dora, the underground rocket factory where tens of thousands of slave laborers died building weapons. He took control of the V2 operational program. He took control of the Me-262 jet program. By the final months of the war, he was one of the most powerful figures in the Reich's military-industrial apparatus, answering directly to Hitler. This is not a contested account. It is documented. What is contested is what happened next. The official account, the cyanide suicide on the 7th of May, the death declaration issued in September of 1948, rests on witness testimonies that serious researchers have labeled fictitious in a proceeding that produced a death certificate without a body and that was concluded with a speed that, given the circumstances, continues to invite scrutiny. The counter-evidence, the American interrogation order of November 1945, the CIC interview report, the Richardson account, the emptied files, points towards survival and American contact, without rising to the standard of documented proof that a criminal trial would require. The balance of the available evidence, taken together, does not support the official account with the confidence that the finality of a legal death declaration implies. It supports, instead, the conclusion that what happened to Hans Kammler after the 9th of May 1945 is not known with certainty, and that the absence of certainty reflects, at least in part, deliberate institutional management. That conclusion is itself historically significant. The Nuremberg trials were the foundational moment of modern international criminal law, the event that established the principle that those who plan and administer mass atrocity on behalf of a state are personally criminally responsible for what they do, and that this responsibility survives the destruction of the state that employed them. The principle was real, it was applied to the defendants who stood trial, but it was not applied universally, and the cases in which it was not applied were not random. They reflected the same interplay of strategic interest, institutional inertia, and deliberate management that characterized the handling of German scientific expertise under Operation Paperclip. The man who built Birkenau was not at Nuremberg because it was convenient for him not to be there, either because he was dead, which the evidence does not clearly establish, or because someone had decided that the information he possessed was worth more than the accountability his presence would have enabled. The long arc of post-war German reckoning with the Nazi past has been, by any reasonable measure, more extensive and more serious than that of most countries that have been required to confront similar histories. The trials that continued through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and into the present century, the prosecution of concentration camp guards well into their 80s and 90s, the sustained work of the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg, the educational programs mandated in German schools, represent a genuine institutional commitment to maintaining the historical record and to asserting that the principle of accountability does not have a statute of limitations when the crimes in question are crimes against humanity. The work of the Dora Memorial, of the Auschwitz State Museum, of the hundreds of smaller local memorial institutions across Germany and Austria and Poland is a part of this commitment. It does not redeem what was done, but it represents a form of institutional seriousness about historical truth that not every country that has faced comparable histories has demonstrated. The specific gap represented by Kammler, his absence from any formal legal proceeding, his missing files, his contested fate, remains a challenge to this broader reckoning. It is a challenge not because the German state is responsible for the American intelligence files that may or may not document his fate, but because the completeness of the historical record depends on the cooperation of all the institutions that hold relevant documentation, regardless of national jurisdiction. The argument for full disclosure of whatever remains in American intelligence files related to Kammler is not an argument about German history alone. It is an argument about the integrity of the historical record of the Second World War, which is a shared inheritance of the nations that fought that war and of the international institutions that emerged from it. For the families of the people who died at Mittelbau-Dora and at Auschwitz-Birkenau and at all the other sites of Kammler's construction empire, the question of what happened to him is not primarily a puzzle to be solved. It is a moral statement about the world that emerged from the war. If Kammler died in a Czech forest on the 7th of May 1945, then he escaped justice by the narrowest of margins, a matter of days and the speed of a legal petition. If he survived and was protected, even briefly, by the intelligence apparatus of the power that had defeated his regime, then the moral account of the Second World War's aftermath is incomplete in a way that matters. It means that the machinery of the Holocaust was administered, at its most senior construction level, by a man who was never made to answer for it, and that his escape was enabled by an institution that found his knowledge more useful than his accountability. Both possibilities are, in their different ways, failures. The first is the failure of time, the simple, terrible fact that justice does not always arrive before the perpetrator does. The second is the failure of principle, the more disturbing failure of an institution that knew what this man had done and chose, for reasons of strategic convenience, not to deliver him to the accountability that the principles it had articulated at Nuremberg required. The distinction between these two failures matters, not because one is forgivable and the other is not, but because one is a tragedy and the other is a choice. Tragedies are events that happen to people. Choices are events that people make. And the choices that were made in the handling of Hans Kammler, whatever those choices were, whoever made them, were choices that had consequences for the integrity of the post-war world's foundational commitment to the idea that mass atrocity has personal authors who bear personal responsibility. History does not close its file on these questions simply because the people directly involved are dead. The file on Hans Kammler remains open, not in a courthouse, not in a criminal tribunal, but in the archives and the memorial institutions and the academic journals and the survivor testimonies that constitute the historical record of what the Second World War was and what it produced. It remains open because the people who maintain those records understand that keeping it open is itself a form of moral seriousness, a refusal to accept that the absence of a final verdict is the same thing as the absence of responsibility. Hans Kammler was responsible. The documents prove it. The survivor testimony confirms it. The empty files cannot erase it. He left no body. He left no grave. He left no courtroom statement. No moment of reckoning. No photograph of a man being called to account for what he had built. What he left were blueprints. The detailed, precise, meticulously drafted construction orders for some of the most catastrophic facilities in the history of the modern world. Those blueprints are still in the archives. His name is still on them, and as long as the archives endure, and as long as there are people willing to read them and to remember what they represent, the story of Hans Kammler, the SS engineer who built the architecture of the Holocaust and then, by whatever means, walked out of the frame, will not be fully closed. It will be told. Again and again, it will be told, because that is what the dead deserve. Not resolution, not a tidy ending, but the insistence, across every telling, that they were real, that what was done to them was real, and that the name of the man who built the places where it happened belongs in the record, spoken, documented, remembered, for as long as that record endures.